The silence of space is unforgiving. It swallows every sound, every whisper of life, leaving only the cold, distant hum of the universe. But on a seemingly ordinary morning, that silence was shattered by a call for help. It began with a quiet beep. It was faint at first, barely noticeable. The kind of sound that would usually be dismissed as a glitch, an anomaly in the system. But this time, the beep wasn't ignored. It was urgent. It was desperate. "Houston, we've lost communication. Repeat, we've lost communication with the crew." The voice crackled through the radio, barely audible through the static. The Mission Control Center in Houston froze. There was no mistaking the gravity in that voice. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't part of the plan. The crew aboard the Endeavour, a NASA spacecraft en route to the International Space Station, ISS, had encountered a catastrophic failure in the ship's communication system. The crew, 6 astronauts, had been carefully trained for every possible disaster, but nothing could have prepared them for what was happening now. "Do you copy, Endeavour?" The voice of the mission commander, Captain Jake Marshall, was no longer the confident, steady tone that had reassured the team back on Earth. Now, it was tinged with a note of panic, a crack that was unmistakable. The last transmission from the Endeavour had come through just moments before, the crew reporting a routine malfunction in the engine's cooling system. It was a problem they had dealt with before on smaller missions, nothing out of the ordinary. But now, minutes later, the communication had cut out entirely. All attempts to re-establish contact were met with nothing but dead silence. NASA's mission control staff worked in frenzied silence. Every person in that room knew the stakes. This was no simple failure of equipment. The Endeavour was no longer responding. It was drifting further from the ISS, and every passing minute without communication made the situation more perilous. The astronauts, now isolated in the cold void of space, could only rely on each other in the fading hope that someone would come to their rescue. At that moment, millions of eyes on Earth turned to the one man who could make a difference, Elon Musk. Elon Musk had revolutionized the space industry with his company, SpaceX. While NASA had long been the standard-bearer of space exploration, Musk's private company had redefined the possibilities of space travel. His innovations in reusable rockets and spacecraft had reduced the cost of space missions, and in many ways, SpaceX had taken over as the face of modern exploration. Now, the world's most famous tech entrepreneur was faced with an unprecedented challenge: to rescue astronauts stranded in space. It wasn't just a matter of technology. It was a race against time. The astronauts were drifting further from Earth, and with each passing second, their situation became more dire. The only way to save them would be with a daring rescue mission, one that, on paper, should have been impossible. Musk was sitting in his office, as usual, when the call came through. His face lit up briefly in recognition. It was the NASA director on the line. "Elon, we need your help. We've lost communication with the Endeavour crew. The situation's critical. Can you do it? Can you get a rescue mission off the ground?" Musk's mind clicked into overdrive. He was known for taking on impossible tasks, but this was different. A rescue mission to save astronauts? In the next few days? The scale of the operation seemed nearly impossible. But if anyone could do it, it was him. "What do you need me to do?" Musk asked, his voice calm despite the rising tension. "We need a SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket, a Dragon capsule, and the fastest turnaround time you can manage. We're looking at a launch window of less than 72 hours. Musk paused. The weight of the request settled over him. This wasn't just another mission for a private contractor. This was humanity's safety hanging in the balance. The crew aboard the Endeavour were not just NASA employees, they were people with families, with dreams, with lives they had worked their entire careers to build. He didn't hesitate. "I'll get it done." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Musk's team at SpaceX immediately began working on the logistical nightmare that lay before them. They had never attempted a mission of this magnitude before. The Falcon Heavy was designed for payloads, not crewed rescue missions. But Musk wasn't one to let technicalities stand in the way. "Get me everything we need to launch," Musk instructed, his voice steady but urgent. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it now." There was no time to waste. The Falcon Heavy rocket was already in the hangar, partially assembled for a mission months away. The team had to strip it down and reconfigure it to accommodate a Dragon capsule designed for rescue. Time was of the essence, and every second that ticked by made the odds slimmer. As the engineers at SpaceX worked tirelessly to prepare the launch vehicle, Musk turned his attention to the mission's most crucial element, the astronauts themselves. They were out there, floating in the cold vastness of space, fighting against time, against distance, and against an unknown technical failure that had left them helpless. Elon's thoughts turned to the crew: Jake Marshall, the seasoned captain; Sarah Fields, the mission specialist; David Chang, the engineer; Emily Thompson, the biologist; and the two young rookie astronauts, Jake's best friends from training, who had just joined the team. All of them had trained for years to be here, and now, they were counting on him to bring them home. He sat at his desk, staring at the monitor, watching the live feed of the mission control room. The faces of NASA engineers and scientists flashed on the screen as they scrambled to find a solution, but it was clear, their efforts were running out of time. "Houston, if you can hear us, we need help. We're losing fuel, and we're off course. Please." The transmission cut out again, leaving nothing but static. Elon Musk clenched his fists. He had faced many challenges in his life, but none like this. A failure meant more than just a setback. It meant lives lost in the vacuum of space. "Let's make it happen," he muttered to himself. As the hours slipped by, SpaceX's Mission Control Center buzzed with activity. The countdown had already begun. In less than 72 hours, a rescue mission would take flight. "Ready when you are, Elon," one of the engineers reported. Musk's eyes met the screen. This was it. The mission wasn't just a test of technology, it was a test of humanity. Would they be able to overcome the impossible and bring these astronauts home? He stood up, his face resolute. "Launch in 48 hours. We're doing this." The world was watching. And Elon Musk was about to embark on the most dangerous mission of his life. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Elon Musk sat at the edge of his desk, staring at a series of blueprints for the Falcon Heavy rocket. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each passing second a reminder that time was running out. But in the quiet of his office, Musk seemed calm, focused. In the rush of activity surrounding the rescue mission, he had become a figure of unshakable resolve, a man who had faced overwhelming odds countless times before and always found a way to overcome them. His mind, however, was not always this clear. The path that had led him to this moment was anything but linear. There had been years of failure, skepticism, and doubt, both from others and from himself. Yet, through it all, Elon Musk had clung to a single, unwavering belief: humanity's future was in the stars. Born in Pretoria, South Africa, Musk's early life was far from glamorous. Raised by a single mother, he had an insatiable curiosity and an almost obsessive drive to learn. His childhood was marked by a sense of otherness. He was awkward, often bullied by his classmates for his love of reading and his habit of getting lost in his own thoughts. But his passion for technology and innovation was undeniable. He would spend hours tinkering with computers and gadgets, often staying up late into the night experimenting with his inventions. At age 17, Musk moved to Canada to attend Queen's University before transferring to the University of Pennsylvania. His decision to leave South Africa wasn't just about seeking a better education, it was a step towards something bigger. Musk had always been fascinated by space, and he dreamed of one day reaching the stars. His vision wasn't just about exploration, though; it was about making humanity a multiplanetary species. After graduating with degrees in both economics and physics, Musk ventured into the world of tech entrepreneurship. His first major success came with Zip2, a company he co-founded that created software for online city guides. He sold it for nearly $300 million. With this windfall, he moved on to bigger things, founding X.com, which would later become PayPal. The sale of PayPal brought him another $1.5 billion, but it wasn't the riches that drove him, it was the vision of a future that seemed impossible to most. Musk had a hunger for progress, for pushing the boundaries of what was possible. That's when he founded SpaceX in 2002 with the goal of reducing the cost of space exploration and making life interplanetary. The road to success was far from smooth. His first 3 rocket launches ended in failure. There were moments when the company came dangerously close to bankruptcy. Yet, Musk persevered, pouring every penny of his fortune into SpaceX. The world watched as he defied expectations, determined to prove that private industry could do what NASA had once thought impossible. By 2008, SpaceX successfully launched its Falcon 1 rocket into orbit, a groundbreaking achievement. It was the beginning of a new era for space exploration, an era that would ultimately lead to the creation of the Falcon Heavy, a rocket capable of carrying massive payloads, including crewed missions to Mars. Musk's dream of making humanity a multiplanetary species was beginning to take shape. But success was never guaranteed. Critics had always doubted him. They questioned his ability to deliver on such an audacious vision. Even within SpaceX, there were moments of doubt. Musk was known for his relentless drive and exacting standards, and many of his engineers had to push themselves to the limit to meet his expectations. There was little room for error in Musk's world. In his mind, failure was simply not an option. As the world's first private company to send astronauts to the International Space Station, SpaceX had become synonymous with cutting-edge space travel. But now, Elon Musk was faced with a challenge that no one had ever anticipated. The lives of 6 astronauts were on the line, and it was up to him to find a way to bring them back safely. As he looked at the blueprints for the rescue mission, his thoughts turned to the people on board the Endeavour. These weren't just astronauts, they were the best and brightest that NASA had to offer. Jake Marshall, the mission commander, had spent years preparing for this moment. Sarah Fields, the mission specialist, had a reputation for her quick thinking and problem-solving abilities. David Chang, the engineer, was a problem solver at heart. Emily Thompson, the biologist, was an expert in human physiology, essential for survival in space. And then there were the 2 rookies, Jake's closest friends from training, Mark and Amanda. They were new to the team but had already proven their mettle. Elon Musk knew that the mission to rescue them wouldn't be easy. Space travel was perilous under the best of circumstances, but this was different. The Endeavour had suffered a catastrophic systems failure, and the astronauts were now floating helplessly in the dark void of space, with no way to communicate with mission control. The challenge would be not only to reach them but to do so before their life support systems failed. Musk turned away from the blueprints and walked over to the window. His gaze drifted to the sprawling SpaceX campus below, a testament to his vision and ambition. He thought about the countless hours, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices made by his team to get this far. It was all leading to this moment. The rescue mission wasn't just about saving lives, it was about proving that humanity could overcome even the most impossible odds. As the world's eyes turned toward SpaceX, Elon Musk couldn't afford to fail. The pressure was immense, but if there was anyone who understood how to handle pressure, it was him. "Let's make history," Musk muttered to himself. The countdown had begun. The clock was ticking, and every second brought them closer to the launch window. Up in the cold, silent vastness of space, the astronauts aboard the Endeavour were losing hope. Time had a way of slipping through their fingers in the quiet vacuum, each second longer than the last as they floated, helpless and stranded, millions of miles from Earth. Captain Jake Marshall sat in the command seat, staring at the flickering monitors in front of him. His hands trembled slightly as he typed in a series of commands, trying to re-establish contact with mission control. But the systems were unresponsive, and the screens remained blank, offering no answers. The eerie quiet inside the ship was broken only by the hum of machinery, a constant reminder that they were still alive, but not for long if they didn't figure out a way to solve their growing problems. "Sarah, any luck with the comms?" Jake asked, his voice tight, his words punctuated by the faint hiss of the ship's life support system. Sarah Fields, the mission specialist, turned from her station. Her face was drawn, her brow furrowed with concentration. She was trying to repair the ship's communication systems, but every attempt seemed to make the problem worse. "I've reset the primary comms, but it's not responding," she said, her voice just as strained as Jake's. "I'm trying to work through the backup, but it's a delicate procedure. We need to conserve power. We're running on reserves now, and every minute we're not in contact with Houston is a minute we lose." The weight of her words sank in, and the small crew fell into an uncomfortable silence. Every second felt like an eternity as the realization set in, they were drifting farther away from Earth and getting closer to an impossible fate. The Endeavour had experienced a critical malfunction in its engine cooling system, which had triggered a cascade of failures. First, the comms went down. Then, the power began to dwindle. They had only enough fuel to survive for a few days, and without help, they would run out of air, food, and power long before that. But it wasn't just the technical problems that Jake feared. It was the growing sense of isolation, of being completely cut off from the rest of humanity. The void of space had always been unforgiving, but now, it felt personal. In the cargo hold, David Chong and Emily Thompson were attempting to access the ship's auxiliary systems. The tension in their faces mirrored the one on the bridge. Time was not on their side. David's hands were slick with sweat as he ran diagnostics, muttering to himself in frustration. "This shouldn't be happening," he said, his voice cracking under the stress. The Endeavour was supposed to be the most advanced spacecraft in NASA's fleet. We were supposed to be safe. We've trained for every possible failure, but this, he stopped himself, shaking his head. This is different. Emily, the biologist, had been monitoring their life support systems, her focus solely on the air and water supply. "If we don't get the comms back up soon, we won't be able to relay our status to Houston," she said softly, trying to hide the fear creeping into her voice. "We're running out of time." The two rookie astronauts, Mark and Amanda, were sitting in the mess hall, far from the control rooms. They hadn't been involved in the early stages of the mission's failure, and now, as they looked at their fellow crew members, their faces were pale, filled with confusion and dread. They had been trained for the risks of space exploration, but nothing had prepared them for this. "I didn't think it would end like this," Amanda said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't think we'd be out here, just waiting for something to happen." Mark stared out the tiny porthole, his gaze fixed on the infinite blackness of space. "There has to be a way," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "There has to be." But for all the training they had received, for all their expertise, there was nothing they could do to fix the systems. They were trapped in an unforgiving metal capsule, floating in the void, with no way of knowing when, or if, someone would come to their rescue. Back on Earth, the people in mission control were not faring any better. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't make contact with the Endeavour. The comms blackout had lasted far longer than anyone expected, and the engineers were scrambling to find a solution. Every failure felt like a blow, each one a reminder that their hands were tied. The longer the astronauts remained incommunicado, the more dire the situation became. "We need to act fast," NASA's director, David Allen, said firmly, standing before a room of engineers and mission specialists. His voice held a note of desperation that he rarely let show. "If we don't re-establish contact in the next 24 hours, the astronauts will be beyond the reach of any of our spacecraft. We need to make a decision, now." There was a collective pause as the gravity of the situation settled over the room. The pressure was palpable. NASA had the resources, the experience, and the knowledge to solve nearly any space mission problem, but they had never been faced with a problem quite like this. The Endeavour was far from Earth, and the odds of sending a rescue mission in time seemed impossible. The only company capable of helping was SpaceX, but would they be able to mobilize quickly enough? Meanwhile, Elon Musk and his team were working around the clock. SpaceX had already made history by sending astronauts to the International Space Station, but a rescue mission was a different beast altogether. It would require not just the technological infrastructure to reach the astronauts, but also an immense amount of coordination, precision, and speed. Musk had to overcome not only technical challenges but also the limitations of the spacecraft they were working with. In the control center at SpaceX, engineers were tirelessly working to modify a Falcon Heavy rocket to carry the Dragon capsule, a ship designed for cargo but never intended for crew rescue. But Musk was determined. This was no time for hesitation. The stakes were too high. The Endeavour doesn't have much time, Musk said, pacing in front of his team. His tone was stern but calm. We can do this. We just need to think through every contingency. We're not going to lose them. There was no question in Musk's mind, failure wasn't an option. Not today. Not when lives were on the line. The clock ticked on. For the astronauts aboard the Endeavour, every second was another step toward an unknown fate. For SpaceX, every second was another opportunity to prove that humanity's reach could exceed its grasp, even in the darkest hours of space. The countdown at SpaceX was no longer just a series of numbers ticking down on a screen. It had become a symbol of everything on the line. The lives of the astronauts aboard the Endeavour rested on a narrow margin, on the ability to launch a rescue mission before time ran out. Elon Musk stood in front of the massive display, the control center buzzing with activity around him. Engineers and mission specialists were busy making last-minute adjustments to the Falcon Heavy, recalibrating its systems, and ensuring that every inch of the rocket was prepared for the launch. The usual hum of high-tech machinery was louder now, as everyone worked with precision to make the impossible possible. This was no ordinary mission. This was a race against time, a chance to prove that no obstacle was too great to overcome. We're ready to launch in less than 12 hours, Musk said, his voice carrying the weight of urgency and calm determination. He glanced over at Gwynne Shotwell, SpaceX's president, who stood beside him. We've got the Falcon Heavy prepped, the Dragon capsule is on board, and we're good to go for launch, she replied, her tone professional but edged with the same tension that had gripped everyone in the room. Musk nodded, his eyes fixed on the screen displaying the countdown clock. He had always been calm under pressure, but even he felt the weight of what was happening. There was no room for error. A single mistake could cost them everything. And this wasn't just about the Endeavour. This was about SpaceX's credibility, about proving to the world that commercial space exploration could do what NASA had never imagined, save a crew stranded in space, in the most dire of circumstances. In the SpaceX operations room, the engineers were fine-tuning the systems on the Dragon capsule. They were modifying it to allow for crew rescue operations, a task that had never been done before. The capsule wasn't built to dock with the Endeavour, but they had no choice. The astronauts were still alive, but they would need more than just a lifeline, they would need a precise, swift rescue to get them back to Earth. Any updates on the Endeavour? Musk asked, turning to the communications officer who was tracking the spacecraft's position. We've tracked it, but the Endeavour is now in a decaying orbit, the officer replied, glancing nervously at the data screen. If we don't reach them in time, they could be lost forever. The phrase, lost forever, hung in the air like a heavy cloud. For a moment, there was a sense of cold silence in the room as the reality of the situation settled in. Musk's mind was working quickly, calculating the variables that could alter the course of the mission. He knew that time was their greatest enemy. They couldn't afford to waste a single second. All right, let's stay focused, Musk said, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. We have one shot at this, and we can't afford to miss. Start the final systems check. Once we launch, there's no turning back. Meanwhile, in the darkened cabin of the Endeavour, Jake Marshall tried to maintain his composure. With the power systems dwindling, the crew's survival depended on their ability to ration resources and keep their wits about them. The air was thin and growing stale. He knew that they needed to hold on until help arrived. "Mark, Amanda, how are you two holding up?" Jake's voice was calm, but there was a note of concern in it. "We're managing," Amanda replied, though her voice was strained. "It's just hard to keep focused with everything shutting down around us." Jake took a deep breath. He couldn't afford to let his crew feel like they were giving up. "We've been trained for moments like this. Every minute that passes, we're 1 minute closer to rescue. We just need to hold on." He glanced at Sarah, who was still working furiously at the command console, trying to revive the communication systems. She had spent the last several hours meticulously analyzing the wiring and rerouting power to backup systems. She was fighting against time, and every second felt like it was slipping away. "We're down to the last 30% of our oxygen supply," Sarah muttered, her voice strained. "If we don't re-establish contact soon, we might not have enough air to survive the rescue attempt." Jake nodded grimly, the weight of the situation settling in. The silence was broken only by the faint sounds of the Endeavour's failing systems. In the cabin, the crew could hear the creak of metal and the occasional hissing of escaping gas, sounds that had once been reassuring, signs of a healthy spacecraft, were now reminders of their impending danger. The tension in the air was palpable, and yet, despite the dire circumstances, the astronauts had no choice but to keep moving forward, to keep trying. Back on Earth, NASA was fully aware that this mission would require more than just precision engineering. It would require humanity's ingenuity, collaboration, and spirit of perseverance. As the final checks were made, David Allen stood in front of the team, ready to give the go-ahead for SpaceX's launch. "Every second we waste is a second the Endeavour is drifting closer to an untimely end," he said, looking each person in the eye. "We can't afford to fail. SpaceX is our best shot at getting them back. Let's make sure we give them everything they need to succeed." He turned toward the screen where the countdown clock now read, 10 hours, 15 minutes. The mission was officially underway. As the hours ticked away, SpaceX continued its preparations. Musk's team was locked in a race against the clock, making final adjustments to the Falcon Heavy's trajectory and testing the modified Dragon capsule for safety. Every possible scenario had been discussed, and every contingency had been planned for. The engineers had run simulations of the mission 100 times. But no simulation could predict the unpredictability of space. The rescue mission wasn't just about reaching the Endeavour, it was about bringing the astronauts home alive. And for that, they needed more than just technology, they needed the will to succeed. In the SpaceX control room, a sense of anticipation settled in as the final minutes approached. "We're getting close," one of the engineers said, barely containing his excitement. "Everything checks out. We're good to go." Musk took one last look at the rocket, his eyes narrowing with determination. "Let's get them home." The air in the SpaceX control room was thick with tension as the countdown clock ticked down to 0. Every person in the room was at their post, eyes glued to the monitors, fingers hovering over buttons and levers. The moment had arrived, the Falcon Heavy was about to launch, and with it, the hopes of the Endeavour crew and the entire world. Elon Musk stood in the center of the room, his usual calm demeanor overshadowed by the gravity of the situation. The room around him buzzed with energy, but Musk had tuned out everything but the task at hand. His eyes were fixed on the main screen, watching the numbers count down, each second bringing them closer to launching the most important mission of his career. T-1 minute and counting, the voice of the flight director echoed through the room. Musk's fingers tapped nervously against his arm, betraying the tension he was feeling despite his usual confidence. He had built this company from the ground up, revolutionizing space travel in ways that had once seemed impossible. And now, here he was, launching a mission that could mean the difference between life and death for 6 astronauts stranded in the void of space. "We're good to go, Elon," Gwynne Shotwell said beside him, her eyes scanning the room for any last-minute issues. "Everything's looking solid. Just make sure the trajectory is right," Musk replied, his voice steady but urgent. "We don't have time for mistakes." Outside, the Falcon Heavy rocket stood tall on the launch pad, the flames of its engines ready to ignite at a moment's notice. The massive machine was a testament to SpaceX's technological prowess, designed to carry heavy payloads into orbit and, for the first time in history, rescue a crew stranded aboard a failing spacecraft. As the final seconds ticked away, the room fell silent. Musk could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, his heart pounding in his chest. If this mission failed, not only would the astronauts be lost, but SpaceX's reputation would be shattered. The pressure was unlike anything he had ever experienced. "T-10 seconds, the flight director called. Everyone in the room held their breath. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the words hung in the air, a quiet before the storm. "Lift off." With a deafening roar, the Falcon Heavy rocket ignited, propelling itself into the sky. The ground shook beneath them as the massive rocket shot upward, piercing the atmosphere and leaving a trail of fire and smoke in its wake. The sheer power of the launch was awe-inspiring, a feat of engineering and human determination. In the control room, a cheer erupted. It was a moment of triumph, but they all knew the true test had only just begun. Up in space, aboard the Endeavour, the situation was growing increasingly dire. Captain Jake Marshall had done everything he could to keep the crew calm, but even his usual level-headedness was starting to crack. The tension inside the spacecraft was palpable as the remaining oxygen supply dwindled. They were barely holding on, and the uncertainty of their situation was eating away at them. "We have less than 24 hours of breathable air left," Sarah Fields reported, her voice tight as she looked over the life support systems. "If we don't make contact soon, we're not going to make it." Jake nodded grimly. "We just have to hang on a little longer," he said, though even he wasn't sure how much longer they could last. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Emily Thompson sat quietly, staring at the control panel, her mind racing. The crew had been trained for emergencies, but no one could truly prepare for something like this. No one had imagined they would be stranded on a mission that was supposed to be routine, a simple science exploration mission. Now, it had become a desperate fight for survival. "We can't keep waiting like this," Emily said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not much we can do but wait," Jake replied, though his tone was filled with frustration. "If SpaceX's Falcon Heavy launch is successful, we'll have a chance. We just need to trust that they're coming." The seconds stretched out like hours, each minute feeling like an eternity. Every flicker of light, every strange sound aboard the ship sent the crew's nerves into overdrive. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something monumental. Either the rescue would succeed, or they would be left to drift forever in the cold, silent void. Back on Earth, the Falcon Heavy was climbing higher and higher into the sky, its trajectory locked in. Musk and his team watched the telemetry closely as the rocket accelerated, the boosters firing in perfect synchronization. It was a flawless launch, but they still had a long way to go before they could reach the Endeavour. "Separation confirmed," the flight director said, watching as the first stage of the rocket separated from the second. The Falcon Heavy's core continued its journey toward the outer reaches of space, where it would perform an intricate series of maneuvers to ensure it was on the correct path to rendezvous with the Endeavour. Musk stood at the front of the room, watching the data pour in. His mind was racing with calculations, but there was no room for doubt. He couldn't afford to question the mission now. They were all in. "I'll be in the mission control room for the next few hours," Musk said, finally breaking his silence. "Stay sharp, everyone." As the rocket continued its journey, everyone at SpaceX knew that the most challenging part was yet to come. The rendezvous with the Endeavour was a delicate operation, and any mistake could end in disaster. Hours passed, and the Falcon Heavy closed in on the Endeavour. The crew aboard the Endeavour continued their fight for survival, hoping against hope that the rescue would come in time. With the life support systems failing and their food and water running low, they were running out of options. "Jake, we need to talk about contingency plans," Sarah said, her voice raw with exhaustion. "If the rescue doesn't happen soon, we need to have a plan for what to do." Jake shook his head. "I'm not going to think about that yet," he said firmly. "We're still alive, and SpaceX is on their way. That's all that matters." But deep down, Jake knew that time was running out. Every second they waited felt like a lifetime, and the uncertainty was gnawing at him. Still, he couldn't bring himself to give up. He couldn't let the crew lose faith. Not now. Back in mission control at SpaceX, the rocket was nearing the critical point. The data was coming in, and everything appeared to be on track. The final approach to the Endeavour would require pinpoint accuracy, and the engineers were working tirelessly to adjust the trajectory in real time. Musk was still in the control room, his eyes scanning the screens, tracking the position of the Falcon Heavy and the Endeavour. He knew that the next few moments would determine everything. "We're almost there," Musk said under his breath, a sense of resolve settling over him. "We're almost home." The Falcon Heavy's engines hummed with precision as it approached the Endeavour. In the control room, every eye was trained on the trajectory data, watching as the rocket drew closer to its target. This was the moment, the most critical phase of the rescue mission. One miscalculation, one wrong move, and the Endeavour would slip further out of reach, a vessel condemned to drift forever in the black expanse of space. Elon Musk stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of concentration. The room around him was a flurry of activity, with engineers and mission controllers calling out numbers and tracking readings. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, but Musk didn't allow himself to show any hint of nervousness. There was too much at stake. "T-10 minutes to docking," the flight director said, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "Prepare for final approach." Gwynne Shotwell, SpaceX's president, stood beside Musk, her eyes scanning the control screens, her fingers hovering over the comms panel. She knew just how delicate this operation was. The Endeavour was tumbling slowly in space, its orientation unstable due to its failing systems. The Dragon capsule would need to perform a complex maneuver to dock with it, all while compensating for the forces of gravity and the void. "How are the astronauts doing on board?" Musk asked quietly, glancing at the tracking station's video feed, which showed an image of the Endeavour's faint silhouette against the backdrop of space. "They're still alive," Gwynne replied, her voice tight. "But the longer we wait, the harder it will be for them. They're hanging on by a thread." Musk nodded, his heart heavy. He knew that every second mattered. The crew inside the Endeavour was on borrowed time, and the clock was ticking. Aboard the Endeavour, Jake Marshall had been staring at the small, blinking red light on the control panel for what felt like an eternity. The communication systems were still down, and the crew hadn't heard anything from Earth for hours. They were floating in a vast, empty ocean, cut off from the world they had once known. "Jake, I think I saw something," Amanda Martinez said, her voice weak but laced with a glimmer of hope. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Look outside," she said, pointing toward one of the small portholes. Jake moved toward her, his breath catching in his throat. Out in the distance, beyond the swirling blackness of space, a faint light seemed to be drawing closer. It was moving fast, too fast to be a passing star or space debris. That's the Falcon," Jake murmured under his breath, a surge of adrenaline flooding his veins. "It's here. They've come for us." The crew moved quickly, preparing to latch onto anything that might help in the coming docking. Sarah Fields and Emily Thompson scrambled to secure loose items and check their life support systems one last time. "We need to be ready," Sarah said, a note of urgency in her voice. "If they dock, we have to move fast." Jake nodded, clenching his fists. They had trained for a variety of emergencies, but nothing could have prepared them for this moment. They were seconds away from either being saved or being lost forever. On Earth, the Falcon Heavy was now less than a kilometer from the Endeavour. The final approach was underway, and the Dragon capsule, housed in the rocket's payload bay, was being prepped for docking. Engineers and mission specialists were in constant communication, running simulations and verifying the spacecraft's systems. "Final approach is clear," one of the engineers reported, his voice crackling through the comms system. "All systems go for docking. We're on course." Gwyn Shotwell looked at Musk, her eyes narrowing in focus. "It's all on the line now." Musk nodded, watching the telemetry data with fierce concentration. "We've got one shot at this," he said quietly. "Let's make sure it counts." The control room held its collective breath as the Falcon Heavy closed in on the Endeavour. The spacecraft's docking systems were activated, and the Dragon capsule began its intricate maneuver to align with the Endeavour's airlock. The moment was tense, each second dragging on like a lifetime. Inside the Endeavour, the crew braced themselves for the incoming docking maneuver. They had never felt this powerless, never been so close to the edge. The ship shuddered as the Falcon Heavy's thrusters fired in preparation for docking. "Here we go," Jake said, his voice filled with determination, but even he couldn't hide the raw fear in his eyes. The Endeavour rocked slightly as the Falcon's docking system engaged with the spacecraft. A deep, resonating clang echoed through the ship, followed by the low hum of the pressure seals forming a tight lock between the two vessels. "It's happening," Amanda said, her voice trembling with relief. "We're going to make it." As the hatch to the Dragon capsule slowly opened, the astronauts could see the faint outlines of the SpaceX crew outside. These strangers were their lifeline, the people who had come from Earth to rescue them. The first face they saw, looking through the hatch's small window, was that of a SpaceX astronaut who offered a silent thumbs up. Jake's heart swelled. "Come on, let's go," Jake urged his team, his voice growing stronger. They quickly moved toward the docking hatch, gathering the last of their supplies. The moment they'd been waiting for had arrived. Back at the SpaceX Control Center, the room erupted into a wave of euphoria and relief. The telemetry showed that the Dragon capsule had successfully docked with the Endeavour. They had done it. They had brought the astronauts home. But for Musk, the job was not yet done. They still had to make the return journey to Earth, a task that would be no less perilous than the one they had just completed. "That was one hell of a mission," Gwyn said, turning to Musk with a smile that could barely mask the exhaustion on her face. Musk's gaze remained focused on the screens, tracking the progress of the docking procedure. "We're not finished yet," he said simply. "We need to get them back home. Let's stay sharp." In space, the Endeavour's crew was safely aboard the Dragon capsule, but they were far from out of danger. The next challenge lay ahead, the journey back to Earth, which would be just as treacherous as the mission that had brought them here. As the astronauts settled into the Dragon capsule, Jake turned to look out of the tiny porthole once more, his heart still pounding in his chest. "We're going home," he whispered. "We're going home." The atmosphere inside the Dragon capsule was a mix of relief, exhaustion, and nervous energy. The Endeavour crew had been saved, but they weren't out of danger yet. The journey back to Earth would be perilous. Musk and the SpaceX team on the ground were closely monitoring every aspect of the capsule systems, knowing that any mistake during re-entry could jeopardize the lives of the astronauts they had worked so hard to save. Inside the Dragon capsule, Jake Marshall sat quietly, staring out of the small viewport at the vast, endless expanse of space. The stars had become little more than pinpricks of light, and the distant curve of Earth below seemed almost surreal. "We're finally leaving the Endeavour behind," Sarah Field said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard to believe." Emily Thompson, sitting beside her, nodded. "It's been one hell of a ride. But we're still not safe. Re-entry's going to be rough." Jake glanced at the rest of the crew, all of them fatigued but holding on to the hope that the worst was behind them. But even with that hope, Jake couldn't shake the weight of the uncertainty that still loomed ahead. "We've got this," he said firmly, trying to reassure himself more than anyone else. "SpaceX got us this far. We just have to trust them." The hatch between the Dragon capsule and the Endeavour had been sealed shut, and the capsule was now on its path toward Earth. But re-entry was an entirely different beast. The friction as the capsule entered Earth's atmosphere would cause temperatures to soar to thousands of degrees, and the capsule's heat shield would have to perform flawlessly. If it didn't, everything they'd fought for would be lost in an instant. Back in mission control, the mood was tense. SpaceX engineers were tracking every moment of the Dragon capsule's descent. Elon Musk stood at the center of the room, his eyes glued to the screens. "We're tracking a perfect re-entry angle," the lead engineer said, his voice steady, but there was a hint of tension in his words. "All systems are functioning normally." Musk nodded, though his mind was racing. He had seen many of his projects fail before, but the stakes of this mission were higher than any before it. The astronauts' lives, the future of SpaceX's reputation, and the very notion of what humanity could achieve in space were all on the line. "T-10 minutes to re-entry," the flight director said, his voice now commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "Prepare for heat shield deployment." The countdown echoed in Musk's mind as he watched the data come in. The Falcon Heavy's job wasn't done yet. The Dragon capsule would need to pass through Earth's atmosphere and make a safe landing. There was no room for error. "Can we get a visual on the capsule?" Musk asked. "Negative, sir," one of the engineers replied. "It's still too far out. We won't have a visual until it's closer to the atmosphere." The control room was as still as a tomb. The quiet hum of the monitors was the only sound. Musk could feel his pulse quicken as he glanced at the screen. A flashing warning light blinked red on one of the indicators. "That's not good," one of the engineers muttered under his breath. Musk's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" "We've lost telemetry," the engineer said, his tone betraying concern. "The capsule's position is unstable. We need to correct the trajectory now or we risk missing the landing zone." The room erupted into chaos. Engineers scrambled to pull up backup systems and re-establish communication with the Dragon capsule. Musk stood frozen for a split second, then barked orders to the team, his voice cutting through the noise. "Reconnect telemetry, now. Get a fix on that capsule," Musk said. His mind was working overtime as he ran through a checklist of possible solutions. His eyes darted between the engineers, trying to understand the problem. If they couldn't fix the capsule's position, it could land in the ocean, or worse, crash into the land, costing them everything. Inside the capsule, the crew was gripping onto anything they could find. The journey had turned rough as the capsule plunged deeper into Earth's atmosphere. The heat shields were doing their job, so far, but the cabin temperature was rising with each passing second, and the G-forces were starting to push them back into their seats. "It's getting hot in here," Emily gasped, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "Hold tight," Jake said, clenching his fists. "We're almost through." The capsule shook violently as the heat shields absorbed the immense friction from re-entry. The protective tiles that lined the capsule's exterior were designed to protect it from temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, but even with that technology, the crew could feel the heat seeping in. "Atmospheric pressure increasing," Sarah called out, reading the instrument panel. "We're descending too quickly. If we don't slow down, we'll overshoot the landing zone." The seconds stretched into eternity as the crew held their breath, praying that everything would work as planned. Back in mission control, the tension was unbearable. The engineers had finally re-established telemetry with the capsule. The numbers were coming in fast, too fast to process without a deep focus. "We're tracking heat shield status," one of the engineers said. "It's holding steady, just barely." Musk's hands were sweating as he watched the data. Just a little longer, he whispered under his breath. His heart was pounding in his chest. The capsule was reaching the apex of its descent. There was no turning back now. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the comms. Flight Director to SpaceX, capsule has deployed parachutes. Trajectory is correcting. Landing is imminent. The entire room let out a collective exhale. Musk's pulse finally began to slow as the words sank in. They had made it. The Dragon capsule had survived re-entry, and the astronauts would soon touch down safely on Earth. Inside the capsule, the crew felt the jolt as the parachutes deployed, slowing their descent. The violent shaking from earlier had ceased, and a strange calm settled over them. They were coming in fast, but they were coming in safe. Touchdown in T-3 minutes, Jake said, his voice filled with quiet relief. We're going home. Moments later, the Dragon capsule touched down on the soft sands of the recovery zone. The crew inside, though battered and exhausted, let out a collective cheer. They had survived. They had made it home. Outside, the SpaceX recovery team quickly moved in, securing the capsule and ensuring the astronauts' safety. Musk stood at the perimeter, his eyes scanning the capsule as the recovery team prepared to open the hatch. The door slowly opened, revealing the crew inside, looking battered but alive. Jake Marshall stepped out first, followed by the rest of the team. The sight of them, safe and sound, brought a sense of relief that Musk had never fully understood until now. You did it, Jake, Musk said, offering a rare smile. Jake grinned back, his voice hoarse from the journey. We all did. The morning sun cast long, golden rays over the vast, open recovery zone where the Dragon capsule had landed just hours earlier. The soft, grainy sands of the desert stretched in all directions, but the sound of buzzing helicopters and the low hum of nearby recovery vehicles filled the air, marking the scene as anything but peaceful. Jake Marshall, Sarah Fields, Emily Thompson, and Amanda Martinez stood on the edge of the landing zone, watching as the recovery team moved swiftly to secure the capsule. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were on solid ground. It had been weeks since they had felt the stability of Earth beneath their feet. I can't believe we're here, Sarah said, shaking her head. Her eyes were wide with disbelief, as though she couldn't quite process the magnitude of the moment. The wind caught her hair, but she hardly noticed. We're home, Emily said softly, a hint of emotion creeping into her voice. We're really home. For a moment, they all stood in silence, soaking in the reality of their return. The only sounds were the distant engines of the helicopters and the steady buzz of the recovery vehicles approaching. But for Jake, the feeling of homecoming was bittersweet. As much as he wanted to celebrate their survival, he couldn't help but think about the dangers still ahead. This mission wasn't over. There were still questions left unanswered, and the future held an uncertain path. Inside the command center, Elon Musk was watching the recovery operation unfold, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The tension that had gripped him throughout the mission had only eased slightly, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. His team had pulled off the impossible, saving the astronauts, but the weight of the task that lay ahead pressed down on him with increasing pressure. Gwynne Shotwell approached him, her expression one of both pride and exhaustion. She had been by his side through the entire mission, and despite the triumphant return, they both knew that this was just the beginning. They're safe, she said, offering a rare smile. You did it. You saved them. Musk didn't smile back, though his shoulders seemed to relax just a fraction. We did. But we're not done yet, Gwynne. We've got to figure out what went wrong with the Endeavour's systems. And there's still the bigger question, how do we prevent this from happening again? Fair enough, Gwynne said, her eyes narrowing slightly. But let's take a moment. The crew's safe. That's no small feat. Elon glanced at the live feed showing the astronauts stepping out of the capsule, looking weathered but intact. He allowed himself a small sigh of relief. I know. But that doesn't stop the world from asking questions. What's next? We need to learn from this. The astronauts had been whisked away to a nearby medical facility, where they underwent a thorough checkup. Their bodies were battered from the harsh conditions of space travel and the grueling re-entry, but all of them were alive and in stable condition. Doctors and SpaceX specialists monitored them closely, making sure the extreme physical toll of their mission wasn't too much to handle. "Feeling all right?" a nurse asked Amanda as she sat in the examination room. Her voice was gentle, but Amanda could hear the strain of relief in it. "I'll live," Amanda said, cracking a small smile despite the fatigue. It's hard to believe it's over." "You're safe now," the nurse said, checking her vitals. "Take it slow. We've got plenty of time to process everything." Outside, Jake and Sarah sat in a quiet room, looking out the windows toward the horizon. The desert stretched far beyond their sight, the vastness of it reminding them of the isolation they'd just experienced. "What's next for you?" Sarah asked, her voice soft, almost contemplative. Jake glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "What do you mean?" "You've been through hell," Sarah continued, glancing toward the door, where Emily and Amanda were being attended to. "We all have. But what happens now? What do you do when the world thinks you're dead?" Jake took a deep breath, his gaze drifting back to the horizon. "I don't know yet. I'm still trying to figure that out." Sarah nodded, her eyes softening. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Back in the command center, the team was working tirelessly to analyze the data they'd collected during the mission. Musk paced around the room, glancing at the many screens showing telemetry data, mission reports, and status updates. "They've made it back," he muttered to himself, his mind still whirring. "But why did the Endeavour fail? We need to get to the bottom of this." Gwyn stood by his side, watching as he ruminated over the mountain of data. "We'll find the cause, Elon. But I think we deserve a moment of celebration. The first civilian-led rescue mission to save astronauts from space. That's no small feat." Musk stopped pacing, finally turning to face her. He gave a half-smile, his eyes tired but sharp. "I know. It's just. I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this. We've been lucky. Too lucky. And luck doesn't last forever." Gwyn's expression softened. "You're right. But this isn't just about luck. It's about pushing the boundaries of what we can do. This was a test. And we passed." Elon's gaze drifted back to the screens, his thoughts still swirling. It was a test. But what happens next, that's the real challenge. The world had been watching as the astronauts returned. News outlets covered the mission as if it were the dawn of a new era. People all over the world were talking about Elon Musk, SpaceX, and the incredible feat they had pulled off. The story of the astronauts' rescue became a symbol of hope, a beacon of what humanity could achieve when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds. But for Jake and his team, it wasn't just about the world's applause. It was about something much more personal. They had made it through the darkness of space, and now they had to figure out how to live with the scars that remained. Jake turned to look at his team, the other astronauts who had stood by his side through it all. "We're still here," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We made it. And now we have a second chance. Let's make it count." Emily, Sarah, and Amanda nodded in agreement. They had seen the worst of space and lived to tell the tale. It had changed them all, but in some ways, it had made them stronger. And in that moment, they knew their journey was far from over. It was only just beginning. The recovery center was a hive of activity as medical personnel and SpaceX engineers worked around the clock. It was a place where life was carefully monitored, analyzed, and restored after a perilous mission, but the sense of calm that came with the astronauts' safe return was quickly giving way to a darker, more unsettling reality. The danger wasn't over. It was only beginning. Inside a sterile examination room, Jake Marshall sat alone. He stared at the medical equipment in front of him, heart rate monitors, blood pressure readings, and other sensors, each of them running in the background like a constant reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. He could still feel the heat from re-entry in his bones, the pressure of the G-forces pushing against him, and the terrifying weight of the unknown pressing on his chest. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the glass of water in front of him. The astronauts had survived, but the psychological toll of their ordeal was far from over. A part of him felt relief, but another part felt lost. The world outside had been celebrating their return, but inside, Jake was struggling with the questions that kept circling in his mind. Why had they almost died? What had gone wrong with the Endeavour? And could they ever truly escape the horrors they had witnessed? In the conference room, Elon Musk was facing the very questions Jake was grappling with, only from a different perspective. Musk sat at the head of the table, his gaze intense as he reviewed the preliminary reports from the mission. His mind was racing, consumed by the one issue that had haunted him since the rescue, the failure of the Endeavour systems. They had been able to pull off a miraculous rescue, but that didn't answer the bigger question: what had caused the catastrophic breakdown of their mission? "We need to understand the Endeavour failure," Musk said, his voice low and resolute. "We can't move forward without answers." Gwynne Shotwell, SpaceX's president, sat across from him, a notebook open in front of her. "We've already got teams working on it, Elon. The engineers are analyzing the data, and it looks like we're going to need a full systems overhaul." Musk rubbed his temples, trying to quell the headache that was threatening to take over. "We can't afford to overhaul everything. We need to pinpoint the exact cause. If we don't, another mission could fail. The public trusts us, too much is riding on this." Gwynne leaned forward, her voice firm. "I know, Elon. But we also have to accept that sometimes things go wrong. We just have to learn from it and move on." Musk looked at her for a long moment, considering her words. "I can't afford to let things go wrong again. Not with this much at stake." Meanwhile, Jake's thoughts were far from the technical breakdowns in the mission. After hours of medical checks and debriefings, he was left alone in a quiet, private room to reflect on the ordeal. The tension from the mission still hung heavily in his mind, as though the gravity of what they had gone through hadn't fully set in. "Is everything okay?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. She was standing in the doorway, her face still marked by the strain of the mission but softened by genuine concern. Jake looked up, his gaze distant. "I'm fine. Just processing." Sarah stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "Yeah, I get it. It's a lot to take in." She paused, sitting down across from him. "I think we're all still processing." Jake nodded but didn't speak for a moment. His mind drifted back to the harrowing moments in space, the feeling of helplessness as the Endeavour began to fall apart, the fear that had gripped him when they realized there was no easy way out. And then, the elation when SpaceX had arrived to pull them from the brink of death. "I don't know how to move on from this," Jake said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "What do I do now? I'm not the same person I was when I left Earth." Sarah sighed. "None of us are the same. That's not something we can just fix. But we'll figure it out. We'll heal." Jake stared out the window, watching the sun sink lower on the horizon. "What happens now? What do we do next? We've been through the fire, and now everything is different." The next day, the astronauts were given a rare moment of freedom. After the constant debriefings and medical tests, they were allowed to meet with their families. Jake's mother and father were there waiting for him in a small, private lounge. The moment he saw them, all the tension that had been coiling inside him seemed to snap. "Jake," his mother whispered, rushing toward him. She pulled him into a tight hug, her voice breaking as she spoke. "Thank God you're home. Thank God." He closed his eyes, letting the tears fall freely. The relief of seeing his family again, of being in their arms, was overwhelming. There was no need for words, just the silent acknowledgement of how much they had lost and how much they had gained. But even as he embraced them, he couldn't shake the feeling that the next step was looming over him like a dark cloud. They were safe now, but the future wasn't clear. Back at SpaceX, engineers were poring over the data from the Endeavour's final moments in space. Every small detail was being analyzed, looking for the exact cause of the catastrophic failure. The problem, however, was that there was no single answer, no clear smoking gun. "I don't understand it," one of the lead engineers said, frustration evident in his voice. The system should have worked. The hardware was operational. Another engineer joined the conversation. It was the onboard software. Something in the system didn't respond the way it was supposed to. Elon Musk stood in front of the screen, looking over the team's findings. The more he learned, the more he realized that it wasn't a simple technical glitch, it was a fundamental flaw that could affect every mission in the future. It would require a major overhaul, but the deeper issue was that it had been a failure of human trust in technology. "We need a full system reset," Musk said, finally. "I don't care how long it takes. Fix this, and do it right." Later that evening, as the astronauts were leaving the recovery center, Jake felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. The mission was over, but it felt like the real challenge was just beginning. "What's next for you, Jake?" Emily asked, walking alongside him. Jake glanced over at her, still uncertain. "I don't know. I think it's time I stop running from it. We've survived. Now, we have to rebuild, piece by piece." Emily smiled softly. "That's the spirit. But you don't have to do it alone. We're all in this together." Jake nodded, a flicker of hope stirring in his chest. The road ahead might be uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he had a purpose. They would rebuild, together. And that was the first step toward healing. The sun had long set over the recovery center, and the once bustling operation had quieted to a soft hum. Night had fallen across the desert, but Jake Marshall's thoughts were anything but still. He sat alone in the small room assigned to him, the quiet only amplified by the weight of the silence in his mind. The day's events had been a blur of reunions, medical checks, and debriefings, but now, the calm had settled in like a storm on the horizon. Jake had faced the unknown, stared down the vast emptiness of space, and emerged with his life intact. But there was a deeper cost, one that only he fully understood. The mental toll, the gnawing uncertainty of what went wrong during the mission, was starting to sink in. Could he ever forget the feeling of watching the Endeavour fall apart in front of him, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop it? He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling as if it could give him the answers he sought. No matter how many times he tried to push the thoughts away, the question remained: why had everything gone so wrong? What had caused the Endeavour's systems to fail, despite all the testing and preparation? Meanwhile, across the recovery center, Elon Musk sat at his desk in the command center, his eyes glued to the data stream from the investigation team. It had been a grueling process, the analysis of the Endeavour's flight data, the system's failures, and the troubling lack of clarity that surrounded it all. They had identified one thing, though, a catastrophic malfunction in the onboard software. But why? Why had the system failed, and why had the crew been forced to risk everything just to survive? Gwynne Shotwell, ever the steadying presence beside him, watched the numbers flicker across the screen. "We're going to find it, Elon. We just need to be patient. The cause of the failure might be hidden in the tiniest detail." "I'm not talking about a tiny detail," Musk snapped, his frustration rising. "This was a failure that almost killed them. We don't have time for patience. I need answers now. I need to know what went wrong." Gwynne gave him a calm look. "You're right. But pushing too hard won't help us get to the bottom of it. We need to follow the process. That's how we'll find the truth." Musk leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The pressure of the situation was starting to wear on him. I just can't shake the feeling that we missed something crucial. Something that could have saved the mission. Or worse, what if this wasn't a one-off? Back in the room where he was staying, Jake couldn't help but think about his team. They were all in the same position, alive, but still haunted by the mission's failure. As much as he wanted to push it out of his mind, it was impossible. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't rewrite the events of the mission. What he could do was face it head-on. After a few minutes of contemplation, Jake made a decision. He needed to speak to his team. They had been through hell together, and he wasn't going to face this on his own. The next morning, Jake gathered the crew together in a small briefing room. Sarah, Emily, and Amanda were already seated, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and curiosity. They knew Jake well enough by now to sense that something was on his mind. "Thanks for coming," Jake said, his voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. He stood at the front of the room, hands clasped together, his gaze shifting from one crew member to the next. "Look, I know we've all been through a lot. But we need to talk about what happened. We need to talk about the Endeavor." Amanda raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. "We've all been keeping busy with our own thoughts, Jake. What's going on?" Jake exhaled, pacing slowly as he gathered his thoughts. "The thing is, I don't think we're just dealing with a malfunction here. This wasn't just some freak failure. Something in the system broke down, but I have a feeling there's more to it. Maybe something we missed before launch." Emily shook her head. "Jake, you're not suggesting it was sabotage, are you?" Jake paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "No. I'm not saying sabotage. But I think we need to look deeper. We can't afford to let this go. Whatever caused that failure, we need to understand it completely. Because if we don't, the next mission could be just as dangerous." Sarah stood up, walking over to him. "Jake, we know you want answers. But we've all been through the ringer. We survived, but we're not the same people we were before. This investigation, it's tearing at us all. We're not just facing technical issues. We're facing a whole new set of psychological challenges. We need to figure out how to move forward, how to live with what we've been through." Jake looked at her, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He'd always been the one to push forward, to find solutions. But Sarah's words hit hard. They were right, there was a mental weight they all carried, a shared trauma that no investigation could undo. Still, the need for answers gnawed at him. "I know," he said softly. "But we can't just pretend it didn't happen. If we want to keep going, if we want to make sure this doesn't happen again, then we have to face it. All of it. The truth." The room fell silent. The weight of the words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt as if no one knew where to go from there. But eventually, Sarah spoke again. "We'll find the truth. Together." At the SpaceX headquarters, the investigation into the Endeavor's failure was reaching a critical point. Elon Musk was now speaking directly with the engineers, all of them working tirelessly to decode the issue that had nearly cost the lives of the astronauts. "We found the anomaly in the onboard software," one of the engineers said, his voice grave. "But there's still no clear explanation for why the system failed. There are no indications of a virus or external interference. It's as if the system just shut down." Musk's eyes narrowed as he listened, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together but still far from complete. "Shut down. That's not an explanation. We need specifics. What caused the system to behave unpredictably?" The engineer hesitated. "We've run diagnostics on every system. We're looking at it from every angle, but I'm telling you, this wasn't a simple glitch. It was a deeper malfunction." Elon stood up abruptly, running his fingers through his hair. "So we have no answers. That's not good enough. We need to get ahead of this before it happens again." As the investigation continued and the astronauts wrestled with their own emotions, one thing became clear: the path to recovery wasn't just about fixing technical issues. It was about facing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, and finding the strength to move forward. For Jake, the mission's aftermath was proving to be just as dangerous as the mission itself. But he was determined. The truth would come to light, and no matter what it cost, they would rebuild. And maybe, just maybe, they would come out stronger for it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The sterile white walls of the SpaceX command center seemed to close in on Elon Musk as he paced back and forth, his mind a flurry of calculations and possibilities. The investigation into the Endeavour's failure had taken a frustrating turn. Engineers had isolated several issues with the software, but the more they dug, the more complicated things became. There was no smoking gun, no single culprit that could explain the catastrophic failure. The pressure was building. Not just from the public and media, who were eager for answers, but also from within his own company. Musk had always been the kind of leader who prided himself on his ability to overcome challenges, to push through the toughest of problems. But this? This was different. "We're running out of time," Gwynne Shotwell said, her voice cutting through the silence of the room. She stood at the far end of the command center, arms crossed, watching Elon with a level of concern she rarely showed. "The longer we drag our feet, the more uncertain the future becomes. People are looking to you for answers, Elon." He stopped pacing and looked at her, frustration evident in his eyes. "I know that, Gwynne. But we're not just dealing with a malfunction here. We're dealing with lives. I won't rush to fix this just to save face. The public can wait, but I can't let another failure happen." Gwynne's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. "We're all in this together, Elon. We need you to lead, but we also need you to trust the team. If you keep carrying this weight alone, it's going to break us." Meanwhile, Jake sat alone in his room, his fingers drumming against the surface of the table. The feeling of isolation hadn't left him since the mission. He thought back to the endless hours spent floating in space, each second ticking by with the knowledge that survival was a fragile thread, ready to snap at any moment. Now that he was back on Earth, the same tension clung to him, unshakable. The Endeavour had failed them, but they had survived. The mission was a testament to their strength, their ingenuity, and their will to live. But even with their lives intact, Jake wasn't sure he could ever trust the technology that had let them down so badly. What happens now? He asked himself. The idea of heading back into space, back to the unknown, felt like a gamble, a dangerous risk with a system that had already betrayed them once. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Jake stood up quickly, wiping his hands on his pants before opening it. Standing in the doorway was Sarah, her expression a mix of concern and resolve. "Hey," she said softly. "I was wondering if you were up for a talk." Jake nodded, stepping aside to let her in. "Yeah. I could use the company." They sat down, and for a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken thoughts, thoughts that had built up over the course of the mission, and now, the aftermath. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "You've been avoiding this, haven't you?" Jake looked at her, surprised. "Avoiding what?" "Acknowledging the fact that we don't trust the systems anymore." "Not completely. You're trying to fix everything, like you always do, but there's a deeper problem here. The technology broke. We didn't just have a malfunction, we had a breach of trust. And I think you're scared that it could happen again." Jake's throat tightened as her words hit closer to home than he'd expected. He had been avoiding that very truth, the fact that their faith in the technology they relied on was shattered. What if it failed again? What if we didn't make it back? "I don't know how to fix that," Jake admitted quietly. "How do you rebuild trust when it's been broken like that?" Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes softening. You don't rebuild it overnight. It takes time. We all need time to process what happened, to accept that we're not the same as we were before. And maybe we have to start by forgiving ourselves. Jake let her words sink in. Forgiveness. It sounded so simple, yet he knew how difficult it would be. How could they forgive themselves for putting their lives in the hands of a system that failed them? How could they move forward knowing that a simple glitch could have meant the end of everything? I don't know if I can forgive myself for almost letting everyone down, Jake said, his voice cracking slightly. What if next time, it's too late? You won't know unless you try, Sarah said softly. We all have to forgive each other, Jake. We were in this together. We'll be in the next one together, too. Jake nodded slowly, still grappling with the weight of her words. Trust had been shattered, not just in the system, but between themselves. There was no going back to how things were. But maybe, just maybe, they could start building something new. Later that evening, Jake walked down the quiet hallways of the recovery center, his mind still processing everything Sarah had said. His thoughts were interrupted by a call from Elon Musk. Jake, Musk's voice crackled over the line. I need to talk to you. Can you meet me in the command center? Jake's stomach tightened. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing for certain, whatever this conversation was about, it wasn't going to be easy. When Jake entered the command center, Elon was standing in front of a large screen, looking over the latest reports from the investigation. The data was still inconclusive, but Musk's eyes were sharp, determined. Jake, he said, turning to face him. I need you to understand something. We're not just working on fixing the Endeavor right now. We're working on fixing the trust we've lost. And that means something bigger than just getting the technology right. Jake stood still, his gaze locked onto Elon. What do you mean? I mean that we've all lost something. You, your crew, me, everyone. We trusted the system, and it betrayed us. But trust can't just be about machines. It has to be about the people who build them. We have to trust each other again, Jake. If we don't, we won't be able to move forward. Space exploration isn't just about rockets and technology. It's about human connection. It's about belief in something greater than ourselves. Elon's words hit Jake like a ton of bricks. The weight of what Musk was saying suddenly felt so clear. It wasn't just about the Endeavor. It wasn't just about the mission. It was about the people, the relationships between them that could withstand the impossible. And that, Jake realized, was something worth rebuilding. The next day, the astronauts gathered for one final debriefing before they would go their separate ways. The room was quieter than usual, a subtle tension in the air. But Jake felt a shift inside himself. There was no more denial. No more pretending. They had faced the abyss and come back from it. Together. We'll figure this out, Jake said, looking around the table at his fellow crew members. We may have lost trust in the system, but we can rebuild it. We'll rebuild our trust in each other. And we'll rebuild our trust in the future. His words didn't erase the pain of the mission or the fear of the unknown. But they planted a seed, a glimmer of hope, that maybe, just maybe, the future was still worth fighting for. The morning after their meeting, a new kind of energy pulsed through the recovery center. There was no grand announcement, no sweeping declaration, but everyone could feel the shift. The tension that had hung over the crew since their return was slowly starting to loosen, replaced by a quiet resolve. The work wasn't over, far from it. But there was a sense that the journey had taken a different turn. Jake Marshall had always been a man of action, driven by the urgency of his mission and the weight of responsibility. But as he sat in the command center later that day, listening to the team's latest updates, he realized that their recovery wasn't just about physical repairs or fixing faulty systems. It was about the small victories, the moments when people began to believe in the mission again. And that belief was something they had to rebuild from the ground up. Jake looked over at Sarah, who was speaking with one of the engineers about the next steps for their investigation. He admired her calm demeanor, the way she had embraced the idea of starting over, of making the crew stronger in the aftermath. In the chaos of everything that had happened, Sarah had been the steady hand that reminded everyone to keep going. Now, Jake could see that steadiness in the others too. He'd noticed it in Amanda's quiet determination, the way she had thrown herself into the technical side of the investigation, not just because it was her job, but because she was trying to make sense of the failure. And Emily, always the optimist, was tirelessly reaching out to every member of the team, making sure they felt supported, reminding them that they weren't in this alone. For the first time since the disaster, Jake felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know if they could fix everything, he didn't know if the Endeavor's failure would ever be fully understood. But one thing was clear, they weren't going to stop trying. They were going to face this together. Across the room, Elon Musk was deep in conversation with Gwynne Shotwell and several of his lead engineers. They had made some progress in the investigation, but the answers were still far too elusive. The software malfunction, the system failures, and the communications issues remained frustratingly ambiguous. "We've isolated a pattern," one of the engineers was saying, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "The failure isn't just a single glitch. There's a cascade of events, a breakdown in the software that we hadn't anticipated. But we're still not sure why it happened. There's no clear cause." Gwynne leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the data on the screen. "So, we're looking at a series of failures. Could it be a miscommunication between the onboard system and the external control center?" "It's possible," the engineer replied, "but we can't confirm it until we analyze the full scope of the system's interactions." Musk rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "We need to move faster. If we don't have answers soon, it'll hurt the next mission. We can't afford another failure." Gwynne sighed, sensing the weight of Elon's words. "We're not ignoring the urgency. But we also have to be thorough. If we cut corners now, we'll miss something vital." Elon's gaze flicked between the engineers, his frustration barely contained. "I'm not asking you to cut corners. I'm asking you to think outside the box. We need solutions, fast. Whatever the root cause is, we need to find it before we even think about launching again." As the team continued to sift through the complex data, Elon's mind wandered to the astronauts. They were the real heroes in all of this. They had been through the unimaginable, and now, they were standing on the edge of something bigger. Space exploration had always been about pushing the limits of human potential. But what they had just experienced, it wasn't just a technical failure. It was a test of resilience, of courage, of the unshakable will to survive. He had always been a believer in technology, in the idea that innovation could overcome any obstacle. But now, he realized that the human element, the people who put their lives on the line, the people who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, was just as important. Maybe even more so. Later that evening, Jake and the crew were called into a final debriefing before they would head back to their homes for a brief respite. Elon Musk had requested their presence, and Jake wasn't sure what to expect. He still wasn't fully sure how to trust the system that had failed them, but he knew this was part of the process. This was part of the healing. The room was quiet as they all filed in, taking their seats. Elon stood at the front, looking more contemplative than usual, as if the weight of the past few days had finally settled on his shoulders. "Thank you all for coming," Elon began, his voice steady. "I know the last few weeks have been difficult. I know the mission didn't go the way we planned, and I know that trust, both in the systems and in each other, has been shaken. But I also know this, what you accomplished was nothing short of extraordinary. You made it back. And that's something we'll never take for granted." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "The investigation is still ongoing, and we don't have all the answers yet. But we will find them. And we will learn from what happened. Not just for the sake of our company, but for the sake of future missions, missions that will push humanity farther than ever before." Jake felt a quiet pride swelling inside him. Elon's words, though not a guarantee, were a step forward. There was still uncertainty, still pain, but they were moving in the right direction. Elon continued. But before we move forward, I want to make something clear. This isn't just about fixing rockets or software. It's about understanding that space exploration is not just a technological endeavor. It's a human one. You all are the heart of this project. And we're going to rebuild, not just the technology, but the trust. In ourselves. In each other. The room was silent for a moment. Jake exchanged glances with Sarah, Amanda, and Emily. There was something different in Elon's tone, a sincerity that wasn't there before. Maybe it was the gravity of what they had all been through, or maybe it was the realization that no one was immune to failure. But in that moment, Jake felt a flicker of hope, a belief that they could move forward together, stronger than before. After the debriefing, the crew gathered outside, each of them taking a moment to step out into the cool evening air. The desert stretched endlessly around them, its vastness mirroring the uncertainty they all felt. But even in the face of the unknown, there was a sense of solidarity, a recognition that, no matter what came next, they had each other's backs. "Jake," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "You okay?" Jake smiled faintly. "Yeah. I think I am. It's been a hell of a ride. But I think we're finally starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel." "We'll get there," Amanda added, her voice strong. "One step at a time." Emily nodded, her usual optimism returning. "The hard part's behind us now. We'll figure out the rest. Together." Jake nodded in agreement. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe they were going to be okay. Not just as a crew, but as people who had faced the unthinkable and survived. Together, they could rebuild their trust. Together, they could face the future. As the days passed, Jake Marshall found himself once again looking up at the night sky. The stars had always felt so far away, so impossible to reach, and yet here he was, one of the few who had touched them. But the experience had come at a cost, the endeavor's failure, the loss of trust, and the haunting uncertainty of what the future held. Still, as he stood outside the recovery center that evening, the vastness of space stretched above him, reminding him of the larger purpose they were all working toward. Space exploration wasn't just about technology, it was about humanity's desire to explore, to venture beyond what was known, to seek out something greater than themselves. The mission hadn't gone as planned, but Jake knew in his heart that this was far from the end. It was merely a setback, a challenge to be overcome. Space exploration was never meant to be easy. It was meant to be dangerous, difficult, and yet, undeniably rewarding. And Jake still believed in that reward. Back at the SpaceX headquarters, Elon Musk was deep in conversation with Gwynne Shotwell and the rest of the senior leadership team. They had made significant progress with the investigation into the Endeavour's failure, but there were still many questions left unanswered. The team had identified key issues within the spacecraft's software systems, but the root cause remained elusive. "Are we anywhere near a conclusion?" Gwynne asked, her voice low but urgent. Elon rubbed his temples. "We're getting closer, but we're not there yet. This isn't just a software issue. There's something deeper going on here. We need to understand the full scope of the problem before we make any decisions about launching again." The team sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation heavy in the air. Elon had always been a visionary, a leader who believed in the power of innovation. But even he knew that with space exploration, there were no guarantees. One failure, one catastrophic mistake, could cost not only their mission but lives. "We can't afford another failure," Elon said quietly. "Not after what happened. Not after everything we've been through." Gwynne nodded. "We'll take the time we need to get it right. No shortcuts." Elon's gaze drifted to the window, staring out at the horizon, his mind already racing to the next step. There was a pressing urgency within him, an undeniable drive to push forward, to continue pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But he knew that it couldn't come at the expense of those who had risked their lives for the dream of exploration. They were the true heroes in this journey, and they deserved to know that the systems they trusted would be flawless when they returned to the stars. Jake and the crew had been given a few weeks to decompress and reflect on everything they had experienced. But there was a quiet, unspoken agreement among them: they weren't done yet. They would not let one failure define their legacy. Instead, they would rise from the ashes of their defeat, stronger and more determined than ever. Jake had been keeping in close contact with Sarah, who had been working tirelessly with engineers and analysts to help piece together what had gone wrong. The work wasn't glamorous. It was tedious, grueling, and often frustrating. But it was necessary. They needed to ensure that the Endeavor's failure was a one-time anomaly, not a systemic flaw that could jeopardize future missions. But every day, Jake found himself questioning whether they would ever truly be ready to go back to space. Would the fear of another failure ever leave him? Would the memory of the Endeavor's malfunction linger forever, haunting every decision, every step they took? One afternoon, Sarah walked into Jake's room at the recovery center. She looked a little more worn than usual, her eyes tired from sleepless nights spent sifting through data and reports. But despite the exhaustion, there was something in her expression that made Jake pause. "Hey," Sarah said quietly, closing the door behind her. "I've been thinking. We're not going to get all the answers we need overnight. And I think, for all of us, that's been one of the hardest parts. Not knowing." Jake nodded slowly, unsure of where she was going with this. "I think we need to start preparing ourselves for something bigger," she continued, sitting down beside him. "Not just fixing the technical problems, but preparing for what's next. We're still here, Jake. We're still alive. We've got a chance to try again." Jake let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can. Every time I think about getting back on that launch pad, all I see is the failure. The way the mission slipped out of our control." "I get that," Sarah said softly. "But I think we're letting fear control us. We can't live in the what-ifs. The what-ifs don't get us anywhere. It's the what now that matters." "What now, Jake? What are we going to do with the opportunity we have?" Her words hit him harder than he expected. They were raw, vulnerable, but they were also the truth. Jake had been letting his fear of failure define him, and it was holding him back. But Sarah was right. They had survived. And now, they had the chance to move forward. "I don't know," Jake said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "But I think we have to trust again. Trust each other. Trust the systems. Trust ourselves." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "Exactly. It won't be easy. It never is. But we can't stop. We can't let this be the end of our story. We've got a lot more to do. A lot more to prove." That night, after their conversation, Jake couldn't sleep. He found himself standing by the window, staring out at the stars once more. The same stars that had beckoned him to explore, to push the limits of human potential, were still there. But now, they seemed more like a reminder, one of the risks, the sacrifices, and the unwavering pursuit of discovery. He thought about the crew, about the shared experiences they had endured together. They had been through something extraordinary, something that no one else would ever truly understand. But they had come through it, and they were still here. They were still a team. And as Jake stood there, staring at the night sky, he realized something profound. Space wasn't just a place, it was a symbol. It symbolized the unknown, the uncertainty, the danger. But it also symbolized hope, courage, and the potential for something greater than themselves. They would go back to space. It wasn't a question of if, but when. The next morning, the team met again in the command center. Elon was there, along with the engineers, scientists, and analysts who had been working tirelessly on the investigation. The tension in the room was palpable, but this time, it wasn't just about the technical data. It was about something more. "We're not just fixing a spacecraft," Elon began, his voice steady and determined. "We're fixing the foundation of what we're trying to do. Space exploration is a monumental challenge. But it's a challenge we've chosen to face together." Jake stood up, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. "We're ready," he said, his voice clear and firm. "We're ready to try again. Together." The room was quiet for a moment, before a murmur of agreement spread through the team. They weren't just going to let fear hold them back. They were going to face the unknown, together, with renewed determination. And so, the path forward began. Not just toward the next mission, but toward the stars themselves. The days after their decision to push forward were filled with intense preparation. Each member of the crew, along with the team of engineers, scientists, and analysts, knew that the stakes had never been higher. The failures of the past were still fresh in their minds, but they now had something else to focus on, a new mission, a new chance to prove themselves. Jake Marshall couldn't stop thinking about the Endeavour's failure, but as he walked through the hallways of SpaceX's headquarters, he tried to push the memories aside. It was time to move forward. Every minute wasted on doubt or fear was a minute that took them further from the stars. But it wasn't easy. Every day brought new challenges, new tests. The engineers had to recheck every single system, double-checking the software and the hardware. There was no room for error this time. Every aspect of the spacecraft needed to be flawless. At night, when the crew gathered in their dorms, the conversations often turned somber. They didn't talk about what happened before, but the unspoken weight of it lingered in the air. They all knew the truth: this next mission would be their ultimate test. The test that would determine whether they could rise above the failures and continue forward. One evening, after a long day of testing and review, Jake met up with Sarah on the observation deck. The view of the distant horizon was peaceful, the stars twinkling in the night sky. But there was still a sense of tension in the air, the quiet before the storm. "You've been quiet lately," Sarah said, her voice gentle but perceptive. "What's going through your head, Jake?" Jake leaned against the railing, staring out at the stars. "Just trying to keep it together, you know. Every time we get one step closer, I can't help but think, what if we fail again? What if we're not ready? What if we're not meant to be up there?" Sarah joined him by the railing, looking out at the same stars. "I think we're all wondering that. But Jake, this isn't about being ready. It's about taking that step, despite the doubt. It's about trusting that what we've learned, what we've gone through, will get us to where we need to be. The past is behind us, but we can use it to build something stronger." Jake sighed. "I know. But it doesn't make it easier. The stakes feel so much higher this time." "They are," Sarah agreed, "but that's what makes it worth it. We're not just doing this for us. We're doing it for the future. For all the people who will follow in our footsteps. For the dream of reaching the stars." Jake turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers. There was something about her calm assurance that made him feel like they could face anything. She had become the emotional anchor of the crew, the one who could always see the bigger picture when everything seemed dark. "You're right," he said softly. "It's not just about us. It's about humanity's future." The next morning, Elon Musk called a meeting with the entire crew. Everyone gathered in the briefing room, their faces a mix of determination and nervous energy. They had all made it this far, but now they had to prepare for the ultimate test. Elon's presence was commanding as usual, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. He wasn't just the CEO of SpaceX, he was a leader who deeply understood the responsibility they all carried. "All right, everyone," Elon began, pacing in front of the crew. "I know this mission hasn't been easy. I know it's been full of challenges, and I know the scars from the failure of the endeavor are still fresh. But today, we're not going to talk about what went wrong. We're going to talk about what we're going to do next. He paused, letting his words sink in. We're preparing to launch again. This mission will be the most crucial one we've ever undertaken. It's not just about a successful mission. It's about restoring confidence, not only in our technology but in ourselves. The world is watching. And while we can't control the future, we can control how we face it. So, we're going to face it head-on. Together. Elon's words hit home. The room was silent for a moment as everyone absorbed the gravity of his statement. This was it. The ultimate test. There would be no more second chances. The team was ready to go, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. The future of human space exploration rested on their shoulders. For the next several days, the crew immersed themselves in final training simulations, fine-tuning every aspect of the mission. They spent countless hours in the simulator, practicing emergency procedures, responding to unexpected system failures, and working together as a unit. They had learned the hard way what it meant to be unprepared, and this time, there was no room for mistakes. Jake, who had always been a leader in the field, now found himself learning from others. The crew had all grown since the failure of the previous mission, and Jake couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride in them. They weren't just a team, they were a family. They had become more than just astronauts, they had become comrades, bound together by a shared purpose and a shared dream. On the final day before the launch, Elon called Jake into his office for a private conversation. "Jake, I know the pressure you're under," Elon began, his tone uncharacteristically soft. "But I want you to know something, whatever happens, this mission is already a success." Jake looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "You've already proven something incredible," Elon said. "The Endeavour crew, all of you, you've shown the world what true resilience looks like. You've faced something no one else has, and you've come out stronger. No matter what happens on this mission, that will always be your legacy." Jake's chest tightened. The weight of Elon's words settled in, and for the first time since the failure of the Endeavour, Jake felt a genuine sense of peace. They had already overcome the hardest part, the doubt, the fear, the uncertainty. Now, they just had to focus on what lay ahead. The morning of the launch arrived with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The entire crew was gathered in the pre-launch room, getting into their suits, making final checks, and preparing for the journey ahead. There was a quiet hum of activity in the air, but Jake could see it in the eyes of his crew. They were ready. They had faced their demons, and now, they were ready to face space once more. As they boarded the spacecraft, Jake felt a sense of unity unlike anything he had ever experienced. This time, they weren't just astronauts, this time, they were a team, bonded by their shared commitment and their unshakable belief in one another. "All right," Jake said, his voice calm but determined. "Let's do this." The countdown began, and the crew braced themselves for the ride of their lives. They were ready. Ready to face the ultimate test. As the spacecraft blasted off from Earth, the roar of the engines reverberated through their bodies. The ground beneath them faded away, and they were hurtling toward the stars. The mission wasn't just about reaching space. It was about reclaiming their confidence, their trust, and their belief in the future. They weren't just going to explore the unknown, they were going to conquer it. And as the Endeavour 2 soared into the cosmos, Jake knew one thing for certain: they had passed the ultimate test. The roar of the engines filled the cabin of the spacecraft as it lifted off the ground. Every muscle in Jake's body tensed, and his breath quickened as the Endeavour 2 shot through the atmosphere, hurtling toward the unknown. The familiar vibrations of the launch, the shuddering force as they broke free of Earth's gravity, these sensations had once been a source of awe and wonder. Now, they were a reminder of everything they had overcome, everything they still had to prove. For the first time since they'd made the decision to launch, Jake felt a calm resolve settle over him. The fear, the doubt, it all melted away as the blue of Earth faded into the black expanse of space. It was as if the universe had been waiting for them all along. They had made it. They were on their way. Looking good, all systems are green, Sarah's voice crackled over the comms, her tone steady and reassuring. She had been instrumental in ensuring the spacecraft was ready, and she had earned the trust of every crew member on board. If anyone could keep things together, it was Sarah. Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the readouts in front of him. Every system was functioning perfectly. They were out of Earth's atmosphere and moving steadily toward their destination, the International Space Station, ISS, where they would conduct a series of crucial repairs and experiments that could push the boundaries of human knowledge even further. "Altitude stable," said Commander Alice Nguyen, the mission leader. Her calm demeanor was a grounding force for the crew, and Jake couldn't help but admire her ability to remain composed under pressure. "We're on track for the rendezvous with the ISS in T-6 hours." As the spacecraft continued its journey, the crew settled into their routines. Jake and Sarah took turns monitoring systems, while Alice and the other crew members double-checked the equipment they would use to make repairs and collect data from the ISS. Despite the quiet hum of activity, there was an undeniable sense of excitement in the air. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Hours passed, and the crew remained focused, but Jake's mind couldn't help but wander. Even in the vast silence of space, he felt a lingering sense of vulnerability. Space was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. The Endeavour 2 was a marvel of engineering, but it was only as strong as the people who operated it. If anything went wrong, they would be entirely on their own. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden jolt, nothing serious, but enough to cause a brief ripple of concern. "Everything okay?" Alice's voice cut through the tension. "Yeah," Jake replied quickly. "Just a small vibration. Nothing to worry about. Let's keep going." But as the crew went back to their tasks, Jake couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. There had been too many variables on this mission. Too many unknowns. They were heading into uncharted territory, and the reality was that anything could go wrong. He glanced at Sarah, who was still busy monitoring the instruments. She met his eyes for a moment, sensing his unease. He gave her a small, reassuring nod, but inside, his anxiety simmered. By the time they reached the ISS, the crew had settled into a routine. The Endeavour 2 docked perfectly with the station, the airlock depressurized, and they stepped out onto the platform with the familiar hum of the ISS surrounding them. The team had come full circle, they had arrived. The repair work on the ISS was complex, requiring precision and a steady hand. As they floated in zero gravity, Jake couldn't help but marvel at the delicate balance between science and humanity's drive to explore. Every bolt they tightened, every data point they recorded, felt like a small victory in the larger struggle to expand human knowledge. "I can't believe we're here," said Olivia Zhang, one of the flight engineers, as she floated beside Jake. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. "After everything we've been through, we're actually here." Jake smiled, but there was a weight in his heart that he couldn't ignore. "We're here, but we still have work to do. We can't forget what we're up against." Alice overheard him and chimed in. "Jake's right. We've got a mission to complete. Stay sharp, everyone." The team got to work, moving swiftly but methodically as they made the necessary repairs to the station's external modules. Hours passed in a blur of floating tools, complex equations, and focused collaboration. Even in the vacuum of space, the crew felt connected, united in their mission. And yet, the shadow of uncertainty never fully left Jake's mind. He kept thinking back to the events that had led them here, the failure of the previous mission, the struggles they had faced as a team, and the constant fear of failure that seemed to follow them wherever they went. It wasn't until the 5th day in space that things started to take a turn. The crew was preparing to finish up their work on the ISS when an alert flashed across their monitors. "Unidentified anomaly detected," the computer voice echoed through the cabin. Jake's heart skipped a beat. An anomaly? That wasn't something he was prepared for. Can you be more specific? Alice asked, her voice steady despite the mounting tension. The computer's voice continued, anomaly detected in the external cooling system. A significant fluctuation in temperature. The mission was at a critical juncture. The cooling system was vital to keeping the ISS's sensitive equipment operational. If there was a problem with it, everything they had worked for could be at risk. Sarah, what are we looking at? Alice asked, her eyes narrowing. Sarah's fingers flew across the console as she reviewed the data. It looks like a pressure buildup in one of the external cooling pipes. It's not catastrophic, but if it's not dealt with quickly, we could see a system failure. Jake's stomach dropped. They had faced technical challenges before, but this was different. They were deep in space, with limited resources. Any mistake could have dire consequences. We'll need to make repairs, Sarah said, her voice calm but determined. But it's going to require some improvisation. The pressure's too high for the standard procedure. Jake clenched his fists. This was their test, the test to prove that they could handle whatever the universe threw their way. There were no backup plans out here. They were on their own. With every passing minute, the pressure on Jake and the crew mounted. They quickly made their way to the exterior of the ISS, where the malfunction had occurred. The cold vacuum of space surrounded them, and every move they made had to be calculated and precise. Working together, the crew began to manipulate the damaged cooling system, improvising with tools and techniques they had only practiced in simulations. Jake felt the tension building in his chest as the minutes ticked by. They had no margin for error. If they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah gave the signal. It's working. We've got it under control. Jake exhaled, his heart pounding in his chest. They had done it. They had faced the unknown and come out victorious. As they returned to the station and re-entered the safety of the Endeavour 2, Jake realized something profound. The unknown wasn't just a place. It was a challenge, a test of everything they were. And they had passed. As the crew prepared for their return journey to Earth, Jake looked out the window of the spacecraft, gazing at the blue marble that was their home. They had ventured far beyond the safety of their familiar world, and they had survived. They had proven that no matter what the universe threw at them, they were ready. Together, they had faced the ultimate test, and come out stronger for it. The Endeavour 2 was now floating in the calm, endless black of space. The ISS, now fully repaired, was slowly becoming a distant memory as Jake and his crew set their course for Earth. For the first time in weeks, the team had a moment of quiet. The mission was almost complete. They had come so far and faced so many trials, but now, as they prepared for re-entry, the hardest part still loomed ahead. Jake sat in the command seat, looking out the window at the expanse of space. His mind drifted back to the repairs they'd made on the ISS. That moment of uncertainty, the anomaly with the cooling system, had tested them like nothing else. But now, looking at the calmness of the stars, it seemed like a distant memory. They had risen to the occasion. They had done what no one had expected. Yet, there was something in the air that felt different. The pressure was no longer from the mission, it was from within. The knowledge that their return would be the true test of everything they had accomplished. "I can't believe we're heading home," Sarah said, breaking his thoughts. She was sitting at her station, reviewing the final procedures for re-entry. Her eyes met Jake's, and there was a shared understanding between them. Home meant not just the physical return to Earth, but returning to the lives they had left behind, the families, the friends, and the world that had been watching. Jake nodded but didn't answer right away. He had to admit, the thought of returning was both comforting and unsettling. It wasn't just about getting back to Earth, it was about the world's perception of their success. They had carried the weight of humanity's hopes and dreams on their shoulders. Would they be hailed as heroes? Or would people only focus on their past failures? Let's make sure we do this right. Alice's voice broke into his thoughts, always calm, always focused. She was the one keeping everyone grounded. We've gotten this far, and we're not going to let anything ruin this moment. Jake nodded. Right. Let's do this. As the Endeavour 2 began its descent, the crew's nerves started to build again. The atmosphere inside the spacecraft felt charged with anticipation. Every detail, every number, every calculation had to be exact. Re-entry was the most critical part of any mission. One small error could lead to disaster. The spacecraft was entering the outer layers of Earth's atmosphere, and the friction created by the thickening air caused a slight vibration throughout the ship. Sarah's hands hovered over her controls, making micro-adjustments as they fell through the atmosphere, their velocity increasing with every passing second. Altitude is stabilizing, Sarah called out. We're coming in smooth. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was that nagging voice at the back of his mind, the one that had been with him since the moment they decided to continue the mission. It wasn't fear, just a feeling that the true test wasn't over yet. Outside, the sky was changing colors, a deep purple hue giving way to the oranges and reds of the incoming re-entry. The craft's heat shields were doing their job, but there was no denying the risk they were taking. The descent was faster than anything they had experienced. The Endeavour 2 was heading toward Earth with incredible speed, and every second felt like it could be their last. Systems holding steady, Sarah reported, her eyes never leaving her monitors. We've got this. But then, just as Jake was about to respond, the spacecraft jolted again, this time harder than before. The lights flickered briefly, and the calm of the cabin turned into a tense silence. Status? Alice's voice was firm, cutting through the tension. Sarah's eyes darted across the screens, her expression tight. It's a thruster issue. We've lost power to one of the rear thrusters. We're not going to be able to stabilize the descent without it. Jake's heart rate spiked. The thrusters were a vital part of controlling the craft's re-entry. Without them, they would come in too fast or too steep. There was no time for panic. He focused on the systems, taking a deep breath to clear his mind. This was just another obstacle. They had overcome worse. Can we fix it? Jake asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. Sarah shook her head, a hint of regret in her eyes. No time. We have to make do with what we have. The seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last. The decision was made. They would have to rely on manual control. Jake's hands flew over the console, expertly adjusting the remaining thrusters, trying to adjust their trajectory. It was a risky move, but they had no choice. They had trained for moments like this. Brace for impact, Jake called out, his voice firm and commanding. This is going to be a bumpy ride. The crew tightened their harnesses and braced themselves for the final descent. There was no going back now. The atmosphere outside was growing thicker, and the spacecraft began to shudder more violently. All systems failing, came the computer's cold voice. Warning, instability detected in descent trajectory. The red lights flickered across the dashboard as the Endeavour 2 descended faster and faster, the air resistance growing stronger by the second. The turbulence inside was intense now, like a violent storm battering the spacecraft. But despite the panic and the warnings flashing across the console, Jake's mind remained clear. He had one focus now, the landing. Hang on, everyone, Jake muttered to himself, fingers dancing over the controls. The craft groaned in protest, the friction with the atmosphere screaming in a way that made his ears ring. Yet, somehow, they continued to plunge forward, still on course, still moving. In the final moments before landing, the crew could do nothing but hold on. There was no more time for adjustments, no more room for error. The ground was coming up fast, and as Jake looked out the window, the landscape of Earth finally emerged from the swirling clouds of re-entry. With one final adjustment, Jake's hand slammed down on the manual controls. A sharp jolt reverberated through the spacecraft as they touched down, a cloud of dust kicking up around them. The landing gear screamed as it absorbed the impact, but they had made it. They were home. Silence filled the cabin for a moment, broken only by the sounds of heavy breathing. The crew was alive. The spacecraft had landed. It wasn't a perfect landing, but they had made it. Jake let out a long breath, his body shaking from the sheer intensity of the descent. He looked around at his team, Sarah, Alice, Olivia, and the rest of the crew, and saw the same look in their eyes. It wasn't just relief, it was triumph. They had made it. They had faced every test, every fear, and they had conquered it all. "Good job, team," Jake said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. "We did it." The crew exhaled together, knowing that despite everything, despite the uncertainty, the risks, and the overwhelming odds, they had proven something fundamental. They were capable of so much more than they had ever imagined. As the hatch opened and the crew stepped out onto Earth's soil once more, the bright sunlight felt like a blessing. They were home, safe, sound, and more resilient than ever. The world had been watching, and now, they had delivered. They had pushed the limits of space exploration, and in doing so, they had proven that nothing could stand in the way of human determination. They had conquered the unknown, and now, they were ready for whatever came next. The moment the hatch of the Endeavour II opened, sunlight flooded into the cabin. After weeks of isolation in the vast, dark void of space, the warmth of Earth was a relief. The air was thick with the hum of anticipation, and Jake could hear the faintest echoes of cheers coming from the ground crew waiting to welcome them home. But the crew didn't move right away. They sat for a moment, taking in the surreal reality of it all. They were back on Earth. They had faced the ultimate test and survived. "Well, that was a ride," Olivia said, her voice cracking slightly as she unbuckled her harness. There was a strange kind of relief in her tone. They had made it. No one was going to tell them they hadn't. The doubts, the fears, and the unknowns had been beaten back by their determination. "Let's get out of here," Jake said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of everything they had just accomplished. As the crew floated out of the spacecraft and into the waiting arms of the recovery team, they were met with applause. For a moment, Jake felt like they were all living in a dream. The media cameras, the smiling faces of family and friends, the cheers, this wasn't just a mission completed. It was a story of triumph, of resilience, and of the human spirit's refusal to give up. Sarah was the first to step off the spacecraft. Her usual composure was still present, but her face was a little softer, her eyes showing the exhaustion they all felt. "You did it," one of the recovery team members shouted as she approached. "We didn't think you'd make it back, but here you are." "Incredible." Sarah didn't say much. Instead, she simply smiled and nodded, her gaze scanning the horizon, as though she was making sure it was all real. After all, the world didn't know the half of what they had just been through. No one could truly understand the gravity of their journey except for the people who had been on the mission, who had lived it, breathed it, and feared it. As Jake stepped off the craft behind her, he couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude. The sight of Earth, so beautiful and peaceful, was a stark contrast to the harshness of space. He felt the weight of the past weeks lift off his shoulders. It wasn't just a landing, it was the completion of a chapter in their lives that would define them forever. Alice was the next to step out, her eyes scanning the crowd. As mission commander, she was always the pillar of the team, the one who kept things together when chaos threatened to take over. But now, as she met the eyes of the ground crew, there was a visible sense of pride in her. She didn't need to say anything, her posture alone conveyed it all. "We made it," Alice said softly, looking at Jake, then at Sarah and Olivia. Her smile was small but meaningful. They had succeeded where others might have faltered. It was a victory they would carry with them forever. The world was watching. As the astronauts made their way to the recovery vehicles, the cameras flashed, capturing every moment. The news outlets were abuzz with coverage. Social media was flooded with hashtags and posts celebrating the crew's return, with people all over the world expressing their admiration for what they had done. NASA's greatest triumph, one headline read. Elon Musk's mission, a triumph of the human spirit, another proclaimed. For Jake, the headlines weren't the point. The mission was far from about fame or accolades, it had been about something much bigger than any of them. But it was hard not to be swept up in the emotion of the moment. The world had rallied behind them. People who had once doubted the viability of private space exploration were now hailing it as the future. As the crew entered the recovery vehicle, Jake could already feel the exhaustion setting in. But there was no time for rest, not yet. The world wanted to hear their story. They had a mission to complete, one that went beyond the confines of space. They needed to share their journey, to explain what had driven them, and to offer their insights on the future of space exploration. Back at the press conference, the room was packed with reporters and media outlets from around the world. The crew stood at the front, ready to face the inevitable questions that would come their way. Jake stood next to Alice, Olivia, Sarah, and the rest of the crew. For the first time, they all felt like a cohesive unit, a team that had not only survived but triumphed. Ladies and gentlemen, the lead press officer began, we welcome you to this momentous occasion, the return of the Endeavour 2 crew after a successful mission to the International Space Station and beyond. We are joined today by the crew members, as well as Elon Musk, whose vision made this historic mission possible. The room erupted in applause as Elon Musk walked onto the stage. His usual quiet confidence was on full display as he approached the microphone. Thank you for the warm welcome, Musk began. What these incredible individuals have accomplished is nothing short of extraordinary. They've proven that when humanity works together, there is no limit to what we can achieve. They've gone to the edges of the universe, faced unimaginable challenges, and come back with knowledge that will change the course of history. The crew stood proudly as Musk spoke, but it was clear they were focused on one thing, the story they had to tell. One by one, the crew members were introduced, and each shared a few words. When it was Jake's turn, he walked up to the microphone, feeling the weight of the world watching him. But this wasn't a time for speeches. It was a time for honesty. We came into this mission knowing there were risks, Jake said, his voice steady. But we also knew there was something much bigger at stake. The future of space exploration. The future of humanity. And what we've learned is that we're capable of far more than we think. Every single one of us has the ability to face the unknown and come out stronger on the other side. We didn't just go to space, we learned what it really means to be human. The room fell silent, the gravity of Jake's words hanging in the air. The crew exchanged looks of quiet understanding. This wasn't just about the technology, the craft, or even the mission. It was about the people, what they had learned, and what they would continue to learn as they ventured into the future of space exploration. Later that night, after the press conference and the whirlwind of media attention, Jake stood on the balcony of his hotel room, looking out over the city. He had heard all the accolades, all the praise, but it was the quiet moments that meant the most. It was in the stillness that the true value of their journey revealed itself. He wasn't just a hero because of what he had accomplished in space, he was a hero because of the people who had stood by him every step of the way. His crew, his family, the people who had trusted him, they were the real heroes. The future was bright, but it was only possible because of the past. They had overcome the impossible, and now the world was watching, waiting for the next step. The days after their return felt like a blur. From press conferences to interviews, award ceremonies, and dinners with dignitaries, the crew found themselves caught in a whirlwind of attention. The world had eagerly embraced their success, and now they were seen not just as astronauts, but as symbols of what humanity could accomplish. But for Jake, the applause and the accolades didn't seem to matter. The bright lights of the media spotlight couldn't obscure the restlessness that had started to settle within him. They had completed the mission, yes, but the question remained, what now? Jake had never been one to rest on his laurels. He had learned early on in his career that success was just a stepping stone. There would always be another challenge, another mission, another frontier to cross. The real mission had only just begun. One evening, as the crew relaxed at a private gathering to decompress, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the world was about to change again, and he needed to be part of that change. Space exploration was just at the beginning of its true potential. The journey to Mars. Colonization of distant moons. The search for extraterrestrial life. These were the frontiers that awaited, and Jake knew the best way to honor their success was to push the boundaries further. He leaned forward at the table, his eyes focused on the team. We've done something incredible. No one will forget the Endeavour 2 mission, but there's still so much more to do. The next horizon is out there waiting for us. And I'm not ready to just sit here and bask in the glory. Sarah looked up from her drink, her expression one of quiet understanding. She was always the first to recognize when Jake's mind was already elsewhere, plotting the next step. "Jake, what are you saying?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "I'm saying we need to start planning for the next mission," Jake replied, his voice firm but passionate. This moment, it's not the end. It's the beginning." The crew exchanged looks. They had all felt it, too, the sense that the mission, while momentous, was merely one chapter in a much larger story. Alice, the ever-composed leader, was the next to speak. "You're right," she said, nodding slowly. "We've proven we can do the impossible, but the hardest part is keeping that momentum. The world's watching, and now we need to keep pushing forward." Jake could see it in her eyes, she was already thinking about the next steps, just like him. The Endeavour 2 was a success, but the challenges of exploring deep space, of venturing to Mars, or even farther, would require new levels of commitment, preparation, and collaboration. "Let's talk to Musk," Olivia suggested, her voice laced with determination. "He'll back us if we're serious about this. He's been pushing the boundaries of space for years now." Sarah smiled wryly. "Musk will never say no. He's always looking for the next big thing." Jake chuckled, but the thought of working with Musk again, on a mission that would push humanity further than ever before, excited him. The idea of a Mars mission, or even beyond that, was no longer a distant dream, it was a possibility. The next day, Jake and the crew met with Elon Musk at SpaceX headquarters. The entire room felt charged with energy. Musk was known for his unconventional ideas, and Jake knew he would be the kind of visionary to push them into uncharted territory. "I'm glad you're all here," Musk said as he greeted them. "I've been following your mission closely. You did something remarkable out there, and now, I think it's time to do something even more extraordinary." Jake sat at the head of the table, his mind already racing with possibilities. "We're ready to take the next step," he said. "We've proven we can work together, face the unknown, and come out on top. Now we need to set our sights on Mars." Musk's eyes lit up at the mention of Mars. He had long dreamed of humanity becoming a multiplanetary species, and the Endeavour 2 mission had only validated that dream in his eyes. "Exactly," Musk said, leaning forward. "I've always said that SpaceX's goal is not just to get to Mars but to make it possible for humans to live there. You guys are the perfect team to make that happen." The room filled with a quiet buzz. The idea of actually colonizing Mars had been on the table for years, but now, with the success of the Endeavour 2 mission, it felt real. They weren't just explorers, they were the vanguard of humanity's future. Jake couldn't contain the excitement building in his chest. "So, what's the plan? How do we make this happen?" Musk looked around the table at the team, a gleam of determination in his eyes. "First, we need to solidify our mission to Mars. It's going to take years of preparation. Resources, technology, and logistics will need to be developed, but we're ready. SpaceX has been working on the Starship project, and I think we're closer than ever to having the first viable crewed mission. Jake nodded. We've got the experience. We've faced the dangers and uncertainties of space. Now, it's time to make history. Elon smiled. We're going to need all the help we can get. This is going to take the best of the best from all fields, engineers, scientists, doctors, even the best thinkers in humanity. But we can do this. We've proven it with the Endeavour 2. Now, we take that same determination and put it into making Mars not just a place to visit, but a place to live. The room was silent for a moment, each person reflecting on the magnitude of what was being discussed. It was no longer a dream. This was their future. In the weeks that followed, the crew worked tirelessly to build the foundation for the Mars mission. The Endeavour 2 had given them the knowledge and the confidence to face new challenges. But as Jake and the team met with engineers, scientists, and specialists, it became clear that the true work was only beginning. There were countless obstacles to overcome: life support systems, radiation shielding, food and water supply for long-term stays, and the psychological effects of living on another planet. But for the first time, the crew was united in a singular purpose: humanity's future on Mars was not a question of if, but when. The media coverage continued, but it was no longer about their past accomplishments. The world's eyes were now on the future. Social media, news outlets, and even governments began to rally behind the effort, pushing for the first crewed mission to Mars within the next decade. Jake stood in the conference room, looking out over the team he had come to trust with his life. The challenges ahead were monumental, but there was no doubt in his mind that they were ready. This is just the beginning, Jake said, his voice firm with resolve. The horizon has always been just out of reach. But now, it's within our grasp. And we're going to reach it, together. The room erupted in applause, not just for the vision, but for the shared belief that the future of humanity lay beyond Earth's atmosphere. The journey to Mars, and beyond, was about to begin. The excitement surrounding the Mars mission continued to grow. It was no longer a speculative dream, it was a reality. Teams of engineers, scientists, and experts from around the world were now working in close collaboration with SpaceX and NASA to prepare for humanity's most ambitious endeavor to date. Jake stood on the balcony of SpaceX's headquarters, looking out over the sprawling campus. It was a sunny afternoon, but the usual rush of activity in the air felt different now. There was an unspoken intensity. Every team member was aware of the stakes. They were no longer just building rockets, they were building the future of humanity. Jake ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of everything they were about to embark on. The journey to Mars was no small feat. It wasn't just about reaching the red planet, it was about creating a self-sustaining human presence there. And that would take more than just technology. It would take grit, resilience, and determination on a level they had never before experienced. Jake! A voice snapped him from his thoughts. It was Sarah, approaching with a purposeful stride. She was always a beacon of quiet resolve, and her energy seemed to light up the room wherever she went. Hey, Jake greeted her, turning to face her with a tired but satisfied smile. I just got off the phone with Musk, Sarah said, her brow furrowed in concentration. They're finalizing the designs for the Starship prototypes. We're looking at the first full crew test flight in about 18 months. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The reality of it all was settling in. Mars was not just a vague goal anymore, it was an imminent mission. That's soon, Jake remarked. Do you think we're ready? Sarah nodded. We're as ready as we can be. The technology is coming together. The engineers are working out the kinks in the life support systems, and the radiation shielding tests are going well. But the real challenge is going to be the human element. We've never lived on another planet before. There's a lot we don't know yet. Jake turned his gaze back to the vast campus. The work being done here was unprecedented, and it wasn't just about the mission. This was the kind of thing that would leave a legacy. The world was depending on them. And in a way, that responsibility felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, his voice resolute. "We've faced impossible odds before. We can do this." In the months that followed, the crew was put through a rigorous series of training programs. The training simulations had become more intense, with SpaceX pushing them to their limits. The lessons they had learned from the Endeavour 2 mission were being applied, but the stakes were even higher now. They weren't just training for a spacewalk or a rescue mission, they were training for life on Mars. They spent weeks in mock habitats, simulating long-duration stays. They had to learn how to grow food, generate power, and recycle water in a closed environment. They had to master the intricacies of living in confined spaces for months on end, learning how to cope with the psychological pressures of being so far from home. At times, the stress of it all seemed overwhelming. There were days when the pressure of the unknown felt suffocating. But the crew was determined. They had come this far, and they weren't about to stop now. "Hey, Jake," Olivia said one evening as they gathered in the simulation habitat. "Do you ever stop and think about what we're doing? Like, really think about it?" Jake looked up from the task at hand, wiping his brow. "All the time. But we can't afford to dwell on it. We have to keep moving forward." Olivia nodded, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "It's just Mars. It's so far. It's like nothing we've ever done before. And there's no going back." Jake took a deep breath and walked over to where Olivia was sitting, looking out the small porthole of the simulated habitat. "I get it. But that's the point. We're pushing humanity to the edge of what's possible. We're crossing that threshold. Once we get there, there's no turning back. But think about what that means. We'll be the first to take that step. We'll be pioneers. And we're doing it together." Olivia met his eyes, her expression softening. "Yeah. You're right. It's not about the risks. It's about what comes next. The future." The rest of the crew gathered around, all of them sharing that quiet understanding. The gravity of their mission was palpable now. It wasn't just about landing on Mars, it was about creating a foundation for the next chapter of human history. The months passed quickly, and before they knew it, the time for the first crewed mission to Mars was drawing near. The final preparations were underway, and SpaceX had unveiled the Starship prototype. The sleek, shiny vehicle stood tall against the backdrop of the blue sky, its massive form a testament to the vision of Musk and the entire team. It was the future of space travel, made real. As Jake and the crew stood before the Starship, a mixture of awe and nervous excitement swept over him. It was beautiful, it was intimidating, and it was the key to everything they had worked for. This was the vessel that would carry them to Mars. It felt surreal, but also incredibly exciting. "Ready for this?" Sarah asked, stepping up beside him. Jake smiled, though there was an edge of seriousness in his tone. "I'm ready. Let's get this done." It was time to leave Earth behind, time to cross the threshold and enter the unknown. The journey to Mars wasn't just a physical one, it was a leap into a new era for humanity. As the crew boarded the Starship for its first test flight, the world watched. News outlets, social media, and governments were all tuned in. The moment they had been waiting for had arrived. The countdown began, and the crew took their seats, securing themselves in their harnesses. The massive engines roared to life, and the Starship began its ascent into the sky. Jake's heart raced. This was it, the first step into the vast unknown. The future of space exploration rested on their shoulders. But as the rocket soared higher, the view of Earth growing smaller and smaller, Jake felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This was what he had trained for. This was what they had all trained for. And as the Starship pierced the atmosphere and streaked toward the stars, he knew that there was no turning back. They had crossed the threshold. The day had finally come. After years of planning, training, and dreaming, the crew stood on the threshold of humanity's most audacious journey yet, Mars. Their mission wasn't just a scientific endeavor, it was a testament to the indomitable will of humankind, a collective effort to push the boundaries of what was possible. And now, they were ready to take that step. Jake stood in the cockpit of the starship, gazing out the window. The Earth was a distant orb beneath them, bathed in sunlight. It felt surreal, so many years of preparation, so many sacrifices, and now they were finally on their way. Mars, the red planet, loomed ahead, though still a long way off. The journey would take months, and every moment of it would be a test of their skills, their courage, and their ability to endure. "Everything's looking good," Alice said, her voice steady as she glanced at the readouts on the dashboard. The experienced mission commander had always exuded calmness under pressure, and today was no exception. "We're on course," Jake replied, his fingers dancing over the controls. "We'll be in orbit around Mars in just under 7 months. After that, it's all about the landing." The crew was a mixture of seasoned veterans and a few fresh faces, but they were all united by one singular purpose, to land on Mars and make history. Each of them had trained for this moment, their skills honed over countless hours of simulations and drills. They were prepared to face the unknown with everything they had. The countdown had been a blur, protocols, checklists, and final briefings. The launch had been flawless, and now they were cruising through the emptiness of space, headed toward the planet that had captivated humanity for centuries. The isolation of space felt different now. It wasn't just a vacuum of silence. It was the gateway to the future. Sarah joined Jake in the cockpit, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the control panels. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice gentle, but there was a trace of concern in her eyes. She knew the weight of the mission rested heavily on Jake's shoulders. "I'm fine," Jake replied with a smile, though he could feel the tension in his gut. "Just thinking about what's ahead. We've never done anything like this before." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "We'll be ready. We've always been ready." The months in transit passed quickly, but the routine was grueling. There were no distractions in space, no way to avoid the monotony of the endless void between Earth and Mars. The crew spent their days running diagnostics, conducting experiments, and preparing for the landing. The isolation of space had a way of testing their resolve. It was easy to forget what they were doing when they couldn't see the progress, couldn't feel the ground beneath their feet. But every time they gathered in a common area, they reminded each other of the bigger picture. On the 4th month of their journey, a problem arose. The communication system began to experience glitches. It was minor at first, crackling static, delays in the transmission, but it quickly escalated into something more serious. For a brief moment, the team's connection with mission control was cut off completely. Jake's heart raced as the alarm sounded. They were too far from Earth now to rely on immediate help. If something went wrong with the ship's systems, it would be up to them to fix it. This wasn't a mission where they could afford to make mistakes. "Jake, we're losing signal," Alice said, her voice calm but urgent. "I'm going to run a diagnostic on the communications system." Jake nodded, his mind racing. This was the kind of scenario they had trained for. They had prepared for the worst, but that didn't make it any easier to handle. Space was unforgiving, and Mars was still far away. "We need to fix this, fast," Jake said. "If we lose contact with Earth for too long, we won't be able to land safely." The crew sprang into action, each member taking their assigned task with practiced efficiency. Olivia and Sarah worked on rerouting the communication systems, while Alice and Jake checked the onboard backups. Time felt like it was moving too quickly, but they couldn't afford to panic. Their training had taught them how to stay calm under pressure, to trust in their abilities. Minutes later, the communications system flickered back to life. A crackling voice came through the speakers. "Endeavour 2, this is Mission Control. Do you read us?" Jake's heart let out a silent sigh of relief. We read you loud and clear, Mission Control. We're back online. The problem had been resolved, but it served as a stark reminder of the dangers they faced. They couldn't afford any more mistakes, not with Mars so close now. The mission was far from over, and they knew there would be more obstacles ahead. But they were ready. They had to be. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the moment arrived. The Endeavour 2 entered Mars orbit, the red planet filling the viewports of the starship. Jake couldn't help but stare in awe. They were looking at the surface of another world, a world that had captivated humankind for centuries. And now, they were the ones who would land there. Mars, here we come, Sarah whispered under her breath. They initiated the landing sequence, their focus intense. The starship was designed for this moment, the delicate maneuver of entering the Martian atmosphere and touching down on the surface. But as they descended, a new problem emerged. The landing system was showing signs of instability, and there was a brief moment of panic as the systems fought to correct the course. Jake's hands flew over the controls as he worked in tandem with the rest of the crew. They weren't just astronauts now, they were lifelines, the ones who could guide this mission through its most critical moment. Steady, Alice said, her voice steady but sharp. Just a little more, now. With a final burst of energy, the Endeavour 2 hit the Martian surface with a soft thud. The crew was jolted slightly in their seats, but they had made it. They had landed on Mars. The room was silent for a moment as the reality of their success sank in. They were the first humans to set foot on another planet. This was a historic moment that would change the course of history. Jake stood up, a grin spreading across his face. We did it. There was a burst of laughter, a moment of joy amid the tension and exhaustion. But the work was far from over. They had landed, yes, but they still had a long road ahead of them. There was no turning back now. They were on Mars, but this was just the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?